Hey guys.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
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 How's it going? Hi. James, how are you?
Hello.
Yes, hi, how are you?
Oh. Ready to learn?
Yeah, we're always ready. We've been born ready, my friend. Hopefully with a lot of you guys' inputs. Here you go. James, you got a comfy bed in there.
Yeah. I was reading this book about American policy, about the embargo of Japan that prompted the attack. It wasn't an explicit policy. What happened was the FDR he made a rule requiring specific permission for every shipment of oil and scrap to Japan. But then a group of foreign policy bureaucrats led by future Secretary of State Dean Acheson, they blocked every application. So the policy happened indirectly.
Yeah, I think it was the Japan was getting the oil from Indonesia at the time, right? That's where they blocked it from.
That's where they wanted to get it anyway.
Yeah, I think they estimated that the Japanese economy will collapse in 6 months with that, right? They had no choice to start the war in a way. That's what I read. They had to do something. Yeah, sometimes.
Well, the U.S. was pro-Chinese, and the Japanese were invading China at the time.
Oh, yeah. No, of course. Yeah, there were a lot of hostilities of all kinds going on prior to that. It was not just a one-sided act. I mean, it was already kind of a war, Cold War going on. So, but that one thing led to another. That sometimes happens.
Yeah, well, the Japanese wanted to eject the U.S. from the Pacific, and the U.S. wasn't about to be ejected. It was sort of classic power politics on both sides.
Hi,
Hi, Zach.
Hello.
Hi, Greg. Hi, everyone.
Hi, how are you?
Hello.
Yeah, fine. Thank you. I'm sorry. What's your name? Because I see only 15712. So I have.
Oh, yeah, I know. My Windows, I'm using the Gmail client, and it isn't talking to Windows well. I haven't figured out why, but I'm John.
Oh, hi, John.
By the way,
The other
John,
day you presented some very excellent.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a wonderful background. I assume it isn't real.
I wish.
It isn't real.
John, you could go to your window and you could rename your screen, by the way. You go to the upper right side. There is like three dots there, and you press that, and I think you could rename.
Oh, you can do it in Zoom.
I think so, yeah.
Change it to Richard Zorge.
Yeah, I'm looking at the menu.
If you go, is that like rename?
This is in Zoom.
Hey guys.
I think it's let me see.
Or use another number, 007.
No, it's a right upper corner, and there is a three dots. So you press on that, and there is an option rename there.
One second, guys. Aaron, you can share now if you want to just share. I mean,
I want to wait a few minutes for. I assume you want other people to join.
I can just say that I just gave you an ability. How are you?
Oh, okay, great. I just need a couple minutes.
Zach, are you start recording?
I am recording now. I apologize.
Oh, that's all right.
Turn off your picture. Yeah, sorry.
Haven't found the rename yet. I'll look into it though.
But in the upper right corner, do you see like three
Sorry,
dots?
Greg, let's
Yeah,
pick
yeah.
off-
On a Zoom screen.
Yeah,
and when you
on
press-
yourself, John,
when
on
you press-
yourself, there's a little three dots.
If you
Yeah.
Press on that
And
with the
then
left
there's a
click.
rename about the fifth line. Oh, third line.
Yeah, third line, you
I
press
see.
on that.
You
I
see
see
that?
new in private window.
No, no, no.
Are you in the view, like a, I don't know,
Gallery
maybe
view.
it's a gallery view? Are you in the
Yeah.
gallery view?
John, go to gallery view. Right hand
Excuse me for being
corner,
so
there's
dense
like
here.
9 dots and there's a view.
Okay, I'm not in, yeah, I was in speaker view. Now I'm in gallery
So
view.
try
Yes.
those three buttons in the right
On
upper
yourself.
corner of your screen. Your
yourself,
personal screen,
yeah.
right upper corner of your window.
All right, guys, we can take it offline.
Yeah.
I
I
need
can-
to run through a schedule. I apologize. The technical things start, we can get it offline. I just want to go run through schedules pretty quickly. Like
Just give me a minute. I'm listening. I'm just going over and get my water. Okay.
Sure. So today we have Pearl Harbor, as we've discussed, and Aaron is going to present that. On Wednesday, we have where Hitler went wrong in his Russian campaign. Is going to be John that's going to present it, and again, then on Thursday, I just added the new one, and I'm very fascinated in this subject matter, electric vehicles and the self-driving vehicles. On Thursday, I'll do a presentation on what's the future of electric vehicles and self-driving vehicles. Particularly, I'll examine, Chinese and U.S. markets. They're the most active ones. And if you guys are interested in, we do now every Thursday, we do, last Thursday, we did the history of money. And I brought a friend of mine who was has a quant FX trading website. And basically he talked about his FX trading website. And then I brought James and Aaron. Aaron talked about Aaron is going to talk about the ledger of the cryptocurrencies, but and hopefully in a couple of weeks, he's going to dive in more into the cryptocurrencies and the ledger system, and people don't understand a lot of it. So
When will it be?
I don't know yet. He's going to have to let me know the time and the day.
I'm good. Whatever you let me know. So
All right. So
as long as it's like, if it's middle of the week, it could be a weekend too. It's up to you guys.
all right. Yeah. So we'll, maybe after next, maybe the 2 weeks from now, if it's okay. 2 weeks from last Thursday. So next week I have electric vehicle and self-driving vehicle presentation. And then the following week we can have the cryptocurrencies presentation on ledger system. Then Saturday we have Greek art by it's going to be Paul presenting that in classical periods, and then we have the following Sunday the Zionist state of Israel, and then before that on Wednesday we have Jonathan, who did a beautiful presentation on Teutonic Knights. He's going to do a presentation on King John in England under 1200 and 1216. King John, as we know, was Richard the Lionheart's brother, so should be an interesting one. And then
Zach,
yeah.
Zach, sorry, we don't have anything on December 13th Sunday, right?
Hold on. December 13.
No, we have on Saturday. No,
We haven't started. Yeah, we don't.
No, Saturday, yes, I understand, but no, Sunday, no, okay,
Right. Yeah, we don't. We only do once a weekend.
okay.
So that's that, and that's and then this month we also have a presentation on Idi Amin. Should be an interesting one, or they used to call him, Hitler of Africa. So should be an interesting one. So
You're
and
gonna do that one?
when?
Are you presenting Idi Amin?
Yes, that would be me because nobody stepped up. So, and then don't forget we have also Xenophon Anabasis, which is the part of our history and ancient text. So read that before attending if you can. If not, we'll have Paul is going to present that. So, and that should be on. Anabasis is on the 23rd of December. So without further ado, Aaron, if you want to start or you want to give a couple more minutes.
Yeah, I mean, it's up to you guys. I can pivot now and then we'll do a little bit of the history stuff going into it, but not a lot, I promise. We'll actually get to things, to actual Pearl Harbor this time. Let me know when you guys can see my deck. Let me clean up.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
can-
yeah,
we can see
I
it.
can see it.
Let me just clean up.
Okay.
Let me clean my environment up here a little for a second. All right. And I'm gonna add some stuff, some of the YouTube stuff while we go along. I know some of you might not like that. Sorry about that ahead of time, but there's just some people who really produce some fantastic animation and visual representation of what's
Yeah,
happening.
I mean, whoever presents whatever, and it's their prerogative. We never limit. So if
Sure.
you have visuals to show,
Yep.
and some people that do enjoy it, and that's the way we keep it. So
So this is all part of the larger War in the Pacific, Ketsugo, decisive operation, which is the larger planning for the operation, which once we kind of get into it, for those of you that want to go further in, we can go further into the planning. We'll be able to go into kind of the strike. I'm using the animation features from a couple of fantastic people who've put together, great video on the attack itself, on the sequence of the attack. They put a lot of energy into breaking it down and fully animating it. But no one has sort of done that, obviously, for the planning phase. So that's the piece we can really, if you guys want to sink your teeth into, we could do that. We can go aftermath. We can do a bunch of stuff. So 79 years ago, one of the things I'm going to do is when we get to a couple of the maps, I'm going to show you exactly, or as exactly as I can, where the fleet was 79 years ago right now, which is 1100 hours or 1108 or 1110 Hawaii time, and on December 6th. So, the fleet was roughly about 400 odd nautical miles, 450 nautical miles away from their launch point. So you'll be able to see kind of, where they were, how they were lying in wait, kind of the approach that they took. And then this is what the operation was called by various stages and parts of the Japanese staff and high command, either the Hawaii operation, Operation I, or Operation Z. And at any point, we can stop and get lost in the weeds at any point if you want to. So I'll do a very quick run because I think almost everyone here has been part of the prior 3 or 4 of these, where we covered kind of the rise of Japan and why and how and what, but I want to make sure that we kind of cover a little bit of that just so everyone realizes sort of their mindset. And of course, this is sort of their overall war objectives here, which is, in essence, taking over the Pacific. And actually, I don't even show here the Indo-Pacific. So these, the rising sun flag, there would be more of these going east if we had to. And then, of course, their goal is more going south into Australia. So we've, I think, talked pretty, in a detailed way with sort of the background on the I would call it almost super ultra nationalist Japanese, right? So that was the young officers wing that was really pushing, sort of the vanguard. And then you had sort of the ultra nationalist wing, and those would have been more senior leaders, some segments of the of some of the expansionist factions, and then you'd have the regular nationalists. You think of them as almost moderates. That would probably be about right. And then anyone that wasn't at least nationalist, ultra nationalist, or super nationalist, they were basically, to the left. And I don't even think the left right is even a good analogy. It's really more of pro, Japanese imperial place in the world. Like their big boy seat at the table, and or you're against that. And it was really that simple. And I think we talked before about all the political assassinations, prime ministers. I mean, hundreds. I mean, basically a political terrorism movement for several decades that sort of pushed everybody else out of the way, and really forced everyone to at least be nationalistic, if not, ultra or super ultra.
Oh, Aaron,
Yes,
when
sir.
did did the idea for an attack on Pearl just come out of the normal planning process?
No, not at all. So one of the ways to think about this is that Japan had, I would say 4 colliding constraints. One was they were expanding, which required more resources to sustain their expansion. The other one was they always had challenges when it came to natural resources, which generally most countries then would try to resolve through trade agreements, not exactly like the ones we do today, but at least sort of in high principle, very similar, where you would, it might be kind of corporatist with the nation state, kind of state monopoly helping that agreement happen. And so that was sort of the second constraint. The third constraint was you had this ultranationalism or super ultranationalism, which always kept pressing, right? It was never, let's take a break, let's consolidate our gains, let's reorganize. It was generally speaking, it was a young officers movement, basically major and below. And so it was, like most, young men, 19 to 30, well, let's say 30-ish, maybe not the greatest at planning, and maybe not the greatest at foresight and patience and sort of strategic, practice. And so it looped itself. So that was the third one. The fourth one was just the natural demand of in a weird way, almost 2 states within the state, which was the Army and the Navy. So they were always at each other's throats. I mean, politically, operationally, and even throughout really most of the war until pretty much, let's say, end of 44. So the agreement in principle was, because of the expansion of Japan into Manchuria and China, was that the Army basically was called Strike Force North, and they owned basically Earth north of that region, which was really sort of, really west and north. And the Navy owned South. They were Strike Force South, and their responsibility was everything South, to the point that the Japanese Navy fielded its own, you could sort of call them, I mean, they had some that were actual Marines, very, very small, but their own sort of naval force, because they wouldn't trust the Japanese Army, the IGA, being able to agree to the same aims that the Navy had, to the point that you would have IGA forces, you had this in the Philippines, where the IGA forces were not under the command of the IGN, the Imperial Japanese Navy, even though that was their Strike Force South area of operations and their responsibility. And so the IGA was in Philippines was held to account from Japan, from mainland, from the IGA High Command. And the IGA High Command in Japan would not talk to the IGN in command about the Philippines. They would send a message back to the IGN commander in the Philippines. I mean, it was just this kind of, it was almost absurd, or it was absurd. But you had this sort of, so that was the fourth constraint you had. And so in essence, from a military strategy and power standpoint, the Army and Navy in some ways were sort of ripping the country apart in their separate expansionist aims. At the same time, you had the nationalists and ultra-nationalists, which really were a whole bunch of sub-factions that never unified, but except in the broad sort of principles of what it was to be super ultra-nationalist. But they never agreed to kind of exact strategies. So it's kind of hotheads, really. And then the regular nationalists and ultra nationalists, who were more senior colonels, generals, admirals, they would just try to kind of, glue this all together, which they never were ever really do. So that's sort of the four big constraints you had operating really continuously, really until the end of 44, when the losses were so great in the Navy, especially, that everything started sitting back down onto land, right? It was the defense of the home islands, and it was obviously carrying all the way to whatever was going to be the ultimate defense of the main four islands of Japan. So does that answer your question? Does it give you kind of a sense of it, or?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So, this was really this sort of feedback loop, in some ways I would almost argue was sort of a more aggressive and organized version of what the Germans were trying to do. Because the Germans' plans were always so dependent on the whims of the leadership, on the prioritization, whereas the Japanese aims were all pretty fundamental, which was to push all the colonial powers out of the Pacific and gain this co-prosperity sphere, which of course they could use as the resource engine to sustain both the mainland, but also maintain the expansion, hold the expansion basically, and then be able to create such a dominant Navy, Army, and Air Corps that they could sustain some type of neutrality, right? That was this sort of big picture they had, which they were so closed. And I mean, you almost want to think of it as a bunch of continuously compartmentalized groups that just kept feeding each other. I mean, this would be a microcosm version of it, but very similar to sort of the stumbling to war, to the optional war, and to the sort of post-war occupation that the U.S. had in Iraq in 2003, where it just, it was a smaller group of people funneling, intelligence and ideas and hopes and beliefs, and it just sort of, it's just a feedback loop. And I think the Japanese one was, obviously 50 or 100 times bigger than that, but it had a lot of the same hallmarks, right? The same signatures. So this was the thing that makes the it's almost like everything the Japanese were going after is something someone else already thought about, but what they did is sort of modernize it and create and put jet fuel on it, right? It had an accelerant to it, right? So in some ways they were merging like the U.S. Manifest Destiny and the Monroe Doctrine sort of together, and and so it wasn't just one person's crazy idea to take over the world or whatever. I mean, this was integrated planning that they had, even though the separate interest I talk about, you know, the Navy and the Army especially, weren't integrated. You know, they ultimately sort of had the broad aims that were, if that makes sense. You know, I would say this: the Japanese were far more, had far more sort of strategic foresight than the Germans up until you got to the last mile. So they would never really have that, okay, we take over this island in the Dutch East Indies, now what? Right. And they just wouldn't have the now what. It would just be, well, the Navy runs it. And then the Army would say, well, for 6 months, because or per agreement 1937, you know, you run it for 6 months and then you hand it to us. And then it would just be a mess. So that was always a piece they had that was broken throughout the war, which of course, you know, meant you had an enormous amount of internal conflict because many of their strategies they went after ran counter to their largest threats. I mean, one that most people aren't aware of, but really 5 and 6 IGA members of the armed forces were not in the Pacific from a fighting standpoint. They were in China and Manchuria and Korea, and to some lesser degree, you know, Burma and India and Malay. So, you know, it's probably closer to 7 out of 8, really. You know, the more that we study it, and when you recognize who the larger threat was, it was not guerrilla forces in those areas, because whatever they would have lost, they could have come back in 3 years later, 5 years later. Their largest threat was clearly the United States and amphibious marine assaults on islands, and then obviously the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Navy aircraft. And so the IGA really, in a weird way, didn't fight the United States. They fought them in the islands they fought them. And then that was sort of the end of the fight. The Navy is the one that bared really the whole brunt of the U.S. campaign. So, and that's something I think that most people just have no idea about, because it sort of just doesn't make any sense unless you understand just how the aims were so different that each of them have. And a lot of it goes back to the Army wanted to reconquer or to conquer, you know, really a big chunk of East Asia, to be honest. So their war aims for East Asia were almost as absurd as the German war aims for Eastern Europe and Russia. I would say they're basically just as absurd. Regardless if they could have won the right battle or whatever, you know, it's just, you're trying to occupy a space that is just, you know, the only ones that ever had remotely that much capacity to do that were the Mongols. And they couldn't even really take India out, or they couldn't really conquer all of China, you know, for quite a while. And so, anyways, that gives you some early background here.
Wait, just a quick question.
Yep.
I'm a little curious why it was that the Navy and the Army couldn't agree on a long-term trajectory for the future of the empire. Like, why couldn't the Navy say something like, "We'll support the campaign up the Yangtze to support you, IJA, you know, on the land," or IJA saying, you know, yeah, we completely understand that Indonesia has the largest oil fields and we need access to oil. So we'll support a ground campaign in Sumatra and Java to secure that. Like, why wasn't there sort of...
So you're asking sort of a great question. That's, you know, obviously it's one of those, you know, why did Hitler invade Russia kind of questions that is just lost to sort of this weirdness of history. But the practical answer is that both sides had hotheads, right? These super ultra nationalists, right? Who were basically under, let's say, 35-year-olds, 38 maybe, is, you know, in that range. So, you know, 19 to 38-year-old officers. and they weren't just hotheads on the ultra nationalist, super ultra nationalist belief of Japanese supremacy and sovereign domination. They were within their forces that way, right? It was the IGA would want to plant the flag and say, see, we won this for the emperor. And the Navy would want to do the same thing. So you just from that first prism of those young super ultra nationalist officers, which, going all the way back to the 20s, no one could ever really bring to heel. If anything, it just kept expanding and moved its way up into just the regular ultranationalist because they would be sort of challenged and they'd have to sort of, slide further to that right. The second piece had more to do with the separate intent that each had. So this logical sequential approach that you would want to have, which I could make an argument, and some have, that the Japanese could have, it would have been a different slog, but they could have sort of went around the US and, and sort of enforced their neutrality, made it clear that they have the same neutrality that they had before, basically hoping the US would bite, and then attacked, the Dutch East Indies and sustain a long-term attack that would take several years, but try not to drag the US in. So just in essence, sort of playing chess around all the moves. And there was a group of, let's say rational, very senior officers at one point that wanted to do that. They were put on the ice, sent out for like ridiculous assignments that, like basically dead end assignments. And of course the super ultra nationalists were like, no, take them now, take America, it's just go. So you had that component. And then I would say the issue was the Navy would want to capture a resource so the Navy could use it in its larger strategy, not necessarily to share. So a lot of times what would happen is the Army or the Navy, independent of, let's say, good strategy, like the larger macro strategy, would go to take a resource, an iron ore mine, coal mine, whatever, to sort of beat the Navy at it or beat the Army at it. And so they had this perpetual competition, and there was really no way to stop this. I mean, obviously I don't even think the emperor could have stopped it. I think the emperor was always in a lot more fragile position than I think most people give credit for. The emperor went along. I mean, if the emperor really wanted to become a, Kublai Khan, the emperor would have been gone. And you see it by the end of the war when basically the emperor wants to surrender and they attack the palace, right? And basically his Praetorian Guard is what protects the emperor. So I don't know if that answers your question, Rich, or not, but it gives you some sense of.
Yeah, no, the first part definitely did, how the different commanders sort of were seeking their own aggrandizement, and therefore they could create a unified mission. I'm kind of interested though, about the point you bring up about the resource hoarding. How did the Japanese Navy get all the coal that it needed without the Chinese mines? Or was there a good internal transfer of resources that way?
I mean, so what would happen? I mean, so the answer is you would get this sort of horseplay trading going on, right? Because the Japanese Army would need to get support of resources from the mainland, arms, soldiers, etc., and they needed the Navy to ferry them over, and so they would obviously be able to refuel on both sides for that. The Navy would take, I mean, this is how bad it was, right? The Navy would almost always take another coal ferry ship with them, whether it's in the mainland or especially in China, to basically load it up just in case. Basically the IGA gave them the middle finger, and that would happen. I mean, it would happen. They would almost sign their own contracts between each other. I mean, it was just this dysfunctional. and obviously where the Army was highly dependent on the Navy as you went into the islands in the South Pacific to resupply them, then obviously that was generally not a problem. But when it came to the Navy wanting to conduct independent operations, then that became more, far more challenging. I mean, one of the things that really created a lot of impetus for Velocity to modernize the fleet is to move to a lot more diesel and to become a lot more gas dependent, because their goal was to take, gas supplies, and then they weren't dependent on coal for any of their legacy ships, which a lot of their legacy fleet was used for ferrying, right? It was like a merchant marine, really. So you had more of the older inventory of ships that the Japanese had. You had hundreds of those. Those were used, and a lot of those were coal dependent. So they would really try to keep those inside, the Japan, Manchuria kind of, area, and for troop transport and for resupplying. Does that make sense, or?
Yes, it does.
Okay, cool. So one of the things that was always a problem was, and a lot of people today forget about it, but that the Philippines were a U.S. territory for about 50 years after the U.S.-Spanish War, and so the Philippines always represented this problem. And if you look at a map, it's a big problem. Or it's a big, let's put it this way, it's a big problem if what you want to do is big. If what you want to do is small, meaning you take your time, you bring smaller and smaller forces, then you sort of inch your way there, then the Japanese could do quite a bit. But if your goal is to take Singapore, right? If your goal is to really have a large force, tens to hundreds of thousands, or 500,000 across the South Pacific or more, that becomes pretty hard, because the Philippines, because of what the U.S. had there, right? We had more aircraft in the Philippines than we had in Hawaii, in terms of bombers, in terms of fighter bombers, in terms of first generation fighters. We didn't have the same punch of Navy there, but we had a pretty substantial Navy there. And then we had a very large land force there. So the Philippines was all, and it was almost a semi-allied force there too. I mean, it was about 80+% US. Well, it was really, if you were really objective about it, it was U.S. Army, small Marine components, I'd say small to medium Allied components, and a very large Filipino Army component, which was basically a trained U.S. Army auxiliary, which was a pretty, they don't get their credit for how hard they fought, and especially during the retaking of the Philippines, how instrumental they were. So that was always a problem for Japan. So to sort of answer that earlier question about, when the Japanese have been thinking about this, planners, is a famous general, Genda, who is kind of considered one of the great strategists that they had. He always, sort of would throw out the fact that, either we have to change our strategy, or we're going to have to confront the Americans. Let's see. One thing that was going on too, that most people, we've talked about this, is that the U.S. didn't just have an oil embargo. We had embargoes on all kinds of resources, right? So we wound up having steel, iron ore, coal, basically across the whole natural resource spectrum. And these really started for a couple years. So really 39, 40, 41, the Japanese felt this sort of, this noose tightening around them in terms of from the United States policy. And also, and one thing that most people are not aware of, and it really at a doctrine level changed the game. Is in 1940 the U.S. Basically passed the Naval Two Ocean Fleet Act, which was to create two distinctly large naval fleets, one for the Atlantic and one for the Pacific. And that was sort of the fait accompli, because it was obvious what that was for. You know, and obviously the U.S. was going to scale that up. And so a lot of what drove the Japanese, you know, I would say the regular nationalists sort of became ultra-nationalists, and then a chunk of those ultra-nationalists became the super ones, right? And so it just, there was no other space there for anybody else with any other ideas or approaches. And that sort of set, I mean, that was the sort of, you know, the die was cast at that point, really. You know, and so any questions on that? Because I know we did cover that before, but hopefully everyone sort of remembers it. So
Yeah, just one
this map,
question, a basic
ahead.
one. When did the Japanese make the go, no-go decision on Pearl Harbor?
so that's a great question. So that goes back to the chaotic leadership model I was telling you about earlier. So the spring of 41, really actually the winter 41, Captain Genda, who became admiral eventually, or vice admiral, but he really put together what you would say is sort of the plan, or one of the you know, the outline of the plan. And then by the spring, the Japanese, you know, the Navy and then a chunk of the political establishment really got behind, you know, this type of plan. And then really in July, it was around July, I think 11th, is when they had already been presenting on a, you know, tri-weekly to the emperor and to the political leadership, to the, you know, they had this, they basically had this group of 6, which was really like 20, but it was this sort of war cabinet, which met weekly with the emperor for, you know, somewhere between 15 and, you know, whatever, 60 minutes. And when they had special events, then they would meet additional times, which obviously this was. And so really the war cabinet got behind this. Now, a couple interesting things on the war cabinet front. Basically the group that wanted to do this kept throwing this up to the war cabinet, and the war cabinet, instead of rejecting it, kept sending it back for refinement, for gaps, because there wasn't this agreement that this is really what you wanted to do. And part of what they did is they waited until, you know, it's this theater, right? They waited until they could get everyone aboard the war cabinet, and then they officially presented to the emperor, even though the emperor was aware that that's what they were working on, but there was all kinds of other strategies in all kinds of other regions in the Indo-Pacific. And then that's what was presented July 11th. I think it was July 11th. And then from that point on, they then really kicked into gear. Now, what became Rear Admiral Genda, once he kicked off his winter 41 outline, he started the engineering side of it, right? They basically built mock-ups all the way to a small port that they turned into, you know, kind of with like a Potemkin village that they turned into a Pearl Harbor, and all their intelligence they could get, and, you know, people had traveled there, you know, newspaper clippings, all the usual stuff that you could have back then. They you know, basically ran their scenarios against it. I mean, they timed this, you know, and now it didn't work out that way because it never does, but they timed this down for their multiple attacks, you know, for their large waves.
Where was the makeup built?
It was actually in a naval, there was a naval port town on the western side of Japan. So it was, and I'll look up the name, but it's like, it's like somewhere like right along here, right? So it's a place that, no one was allowed in, no one would be there for any other reason. I mean, it was just a naval, it wasn't their Pearl Harbor, but it would just be like another naval base that you would have. And, they got all the population out, and which wasn't very large, and then they basically just mocked up everything that they knew of. It's one of the reasons that when I show you the attack itself, they were so targeted on the parts of the fleet that they wanted to go after. They didn't go after oil facilities. They didn't go after. They really left 99% of the rest of Pearl Harbor and Hawaii alone. They specifically went after airfields, and they went after the fleet itself. They really didn't go after anything else. And a lot of that, in some ways, the U.S. was fortunate, because when the attack sort of had some problems, a lot of the flyers really didn't have a plan B or plan C. And of course, in the modern world, generally speaking, if someone on a flight mission is going, you either have a plan A, B, C, or or none, right? You pull out and don't attack. And they didn't really have that, right? You had a specific job, go after this 1, 2, or 3 parts of the fleet in this part of the shipyard, and that was it. And there really wasn't, oh well, if there's a problem there, what are you going to do? And then so you had this sort of piling on, and we'll see that in a little while. But so just so you guys know, like right now, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, just a question. In the latest Midway movie came out of, the claim is made, it's surprising, I heard it first in the movie, that it was a grave mistake for the Japanese not to go after the oil tanks. Is that correct?
I mean, that's kind of like a historical analysis to say strategically that is, but you would have to have changed the training and the objectives in those missions for months if you had those problems. So yeah, I mean, I think all of us as Monday morning quarterbacks or as armchair admirals or whatever can say that, and it makes sense. But I think when you're looking at what the mentality was in the attack, the mentality was to destroy the U.S. fleet and destroy any aircraft that could pose a risk as a counterattack to the Japanese fleet. And that was it. And then you also have to look at this, we talked about this before, this sort of Bushido code that had been built, which was, very ego driven, obviously. And, if you're a 22-year-old or 20-year-old, Kate fighter bomber, and what do you want to go back home and say you did? You want to go back home and say you sunk a battleship, don't you? I mean, isn't that a cool thing? Instead of, I took out 1.5, oil silos like outside of Newark, right? It just, and you can't underestimate when you have a large group like this. And this was the population that these were almost all super ultra nationalists. So there was this, you could almost look at it as like a manifest destiny, almost a religious sense of what they were doing. And so I think it was pretty hard to get through to people. Hey, if you can't take out Battleship 1, go over here. There's some nice buildings. It's just, that was going to get hard to wash. Let's put it that way. It was doable, but I mean, they obviously, and by the way, they struggled with that throughout the whole war. They really did. There was a sort of an ego-driven behavior, and they gave forces that were very local an enormous amount of control that way. It's actually, it actually made fighting the Japanese in small units very difficult because they actually had a tremendous amount of agility. You could argue almost, as much as the US had really in a lot of ways. But they always maintained that sort of larger ego, which was to do something, monumental, something large. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah, yeah.
That- Just let me add also, though, they didn't have the capacity. This is Joe speaking.
Yep.
They didn't have the capacity to do it at the time.
That's
The
true.
only bombs they had that were capable of penetrating the concrete that was holding most of the fuel, it's not those tanks you see on top.
Yep.
Were the 500-pound bombs, which they were using to kill ships. So
Exactly.
if they used their regular general purpose bombs, that wasn't going to have the effect that.
No, that's
would
a
have been able
great
to knock
point.
out those fuel tanks.
No, that's a good point. But they could have had those Cape bombers with the 500 pounders when, in essence, they could have given squadron commanders a lot more flexibility to sort of self-regulate the attack, right? Typically, when you have these type of aerial attacks, you don't sort of come in a wave and leave, right? You come in a wave, leave, and you basically loiter to get reorganized, to communicate, to collect your intelligence reconnaissance, and then come back in for subsequent attacks, and not use all your resources, which they had obviously large caliber aerial cannons, and they also and rifle calibers, and they also had bombs that were remaining. So, and we'll see this when I show you guys, the attack. They left a lot of opportunity. Is what it really boils down to. So the one thing I wanted to show you is kind of where they were right now. Basically, which if you see my cursor, right around here, 79 years ago. So, that's sort of where, oops, yeah, there we go. Sorry. If you guys see my cursor here on the screen or no? It's over here on the right side by the 30th.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, if you look at the longitude, latitude. So that gives you a sense of how close they were. And one thing, of course, nobody, would have known this at that point, because actually one thing that's important to know is that the U.S. Navy under Admiral Kimmel and under Nimitz and King had already agreed to resupply Midway with one carrier, which was Admiral Halsey, or at that point Rear Admiral Halsey, and so the U.S. carrier fleet was basically over here, and there was one carrier that was around right here, which was Halsey's carrier, and so. Not that the Japanese could have known that, or the U.S. knew that. And the U.S. sailed its carriers radio silent also. So everyone, this is sort of this weird thing in history, right? Everyone was radio silent, right? The Japanese Navy was radio silent. The U.S. carriers were radio silent. It's just this sort of luck of history that happened. So let's see. All right. So one thing I'll give you a little quick background here, and then I'm going to kick into a couple video that'll show you this great kid that's put these phenomenal videos together, and they'll show you exactly what happened in the waves. Not just that, but what they were carrying, who commanded them. The couple things the Japanese did also. So by the way, one of the reasons they picked this, and I'll get the name of it, this small port town, is that it had a very shallow port. And one thing about Pearl Harbor, it's sort of a unique, it's a unique feature. It's not a bug, is that it has a shallow port. And if you're going to drop torpedoes, you need to invent, in which the Japanese basically did. They put these wood flaps, very similar to what you'd see roughly starting about 30-ish years ago, 30 to 40 years ago, Soviet and US first generation sort of dumb smart bombs, which would have basically aerial flaps and very, very dumb sort of guidance that just maintained sort of a line of sight target. The Japanese basically were one of the first ones, they really were, to put this together. And then they tested it out a zillion times. They built these like mini torpedoes. They would sort of drop and into that little port to make sure that they could actually get through. And then they just kept growing those torpedoes until they got to their full 1,000-pounder and 2,000-pounders. Their 2,000-pounders, they really could never make work that way. They were just too heavy. But their 1,000-pounders, and I think they got a 15-pounder working, 1,500-pounder working. So we'll go into that. You'll see that also. And we'll get into a lot of the mechanics of, what ships got hit and et cetera, et cetera. But the thing to also not to forget is that this was not the only attack, right? There was within a matter of, really 100 hours, there was a strike across a big chunk of the Pacific. So it wasn't just this attack. So the Japanese Navy was able to, in essence, sail radio silent across the whole Navy. It's actually one of the reasons Admiral Kimmel got relieved that most people aren't aware of, is that it isn't just the strike on Pearl Harbor, but he was the sink pack. So he was the commander of of the whole Pacific fleet at that point. And basically, we were flat-footed, right, across the whole Pacific. In theory, if all the right pieces had been in place, the Japanese really could have wiped out, the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which is really the majority of what we had, right? That was really 3/4 of our Navy. At that point, about 60% of our Navy. And more importantly, like 80% of our combat Navy, right? Our heavy Navy. So we've seen this before. This is sort of the dream escape plan that they had. The Japanese had various versions of this that, these got bigger and bigger, as they grew further and further into a fantasy, Mongolia and Aleutians and, on and on and on. But this was really kind of the core area of operations the Japanese wanted to completely dominate, basically. All right. So, and then you get to see, and actually this will give you a little bit of a time scale here of the U.S. counterattack throughout the Pacific. Sorry, go back. Yes. So this is sort of the counterattack over the subsequent, 4 years, almost 3.5 years. So, we talked about this, and we'll get in further to the specifics here. Just give me a second to sort of, just give me a second here to. All right. Just give me a second to pull this up, and then we'll pull this back into place here. And while I pull this up, any questions so far? Nope. Anything? Nope. Okay, good. Just give me 10 seconds here. All right. Sorry about that. I have a little browser issue here, of course. It's always how demos work. Oh, come on.
Oh, Aaron, I got in a little late. I got
Yes.
a question. The fact, I guess all of the U.S. carriers were out of
Yes,
port.
we were.
And was that
Yep.
sort of really bad luck for the Japanese?
Yeah, no, it actually was. So the Japanese, it was really just bad luck, and it came down to really the U.S. The U.S. smelled. Let's like one thing I always like to put to the side is these sort of conspiracy thinking. Churchill at FDR, we wanted the attack, like all that's basically BS, right? There's never been any anything conclusive there, and there never will be. The U.S. had broken part of the JM-25 code, but not the whole code, right? So I think most people believe, or most people don't understand that there were many code sets. So we had broken part of the code, basically the diplomatic component of the code, and that's the piece that a set of code breakers and a lieutenant in Seattle had captured on December 7th, U.S. time, right? So we're talking early in the morning, like 2 a.m. Hawaii time. And then they statted it over to DC, and then it went through our bureaucratic kind of incompetent channels. And by the time it got to our leadership that morning, or at least our not political, our let's say our state and War Department leadership, what it said basically is that the Japanese ambassador did not agree with the prior demands from the U.S. and going forward, we being the Japanese, were not going to continue this line of conversation. Right, it was one of these really long-winded sort of diplomatic, ease, which you could sort of read through and say the Japanese are sort of cutting off this line of communication, but not necessarily this all communications. That was the message of that day. So at most, the U.S. believed an attack on the U.S. The most likely was the Philippines, because it made the most sense, which everyone would have agreed it made the most sense. Pearl Harbor seemed so fantastical. It just didn't add up to something that you would expect the Japanese to do and have the capabilities to do, and in some ways be so brazen to do. So part of what happened is going into that prior 1 to 2 weeks, we picked up more chatter, right, as we would say now. It was never conclusive, obviously. It was just lots of chatter. To be honest, the chatter was conclusive in the South Pacific. So that led us to, emphasize the attack on Pearl Harbor. I mean, on Philippines, I should say. And so one of the things that the U.S. was starting to conceive of was carrier first operations, right? Where you lead with a carrier. The concept of, so both navies were thinking of the carrier first operation. And a lot of this came from the British attack on Toronto in 1940 that was so successful in destroying what at that point became the Vichy fleet. And so the Japanese studied that intently. The U.S. also studied it. And so one of the things that happened is Admiral Nimitz, who was commander of all carrier fleets, right? So at that point, he wasn't the CINCPAC. He owned all the carriers. And ultimately, his carrier commanders, Sprunis, Housey, et cetera, like the rock stars of the Pacific, they, once Pearl Harbor happened and basically FDR and Admiral King changed the leadership. And the thing to realize is the same way FDR plucked General Marshall, from number 41 on the list or whatever, he did the same thing with Admiral Nimitz. And so it was almost like exactly the same thing. And Admiral Nimitz then brought all of his, kind of cadre of thinkers and commanders up the food chain, and that became basically the CINCPAC. Almost, it was over like 80 of those leaders that were under Admiral Nimitz at that point really became future, basically, I think it was 84 leaders under Nimitz became future admirals. That's how many he had. So,
But-
so anyways, let me get to the.
But Aaron, to go back
Go
to
ahead.
the carrier question, the Japanese were expecting to find the carriers at Pearl?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The carriers with the battleship. So it's actually very interesting you say that. So there was, like everything in Japan, there was two groups within the Japanese Navy. Someone has some background noise. I don't know. Someone's at a coffee shop or somewhere. I don't know. Okay, great. Thanks. So there was one group in the Japanese Navy planning that was still, and these were the older ones. These were the captains and the rear admirals, vice admirals that were still heavy force. You know, they were very focused on battleships, volume, big, all that stuff. They wanted to knock out, you know, kind of the big capital ships. And then, of course, there was the younger wing, commanders on lower, who were part of this new Japanese, you know, carrier fleet, which at that point numbered around 9 carriers and around 500 plus planes. And they were all about, our goal is get the carriers, get the carriers, get the carriers, right? Because they thought the same way they were, right? They were like tech startup people, really, right? Thinking of their competition being other tech companies. That's sort of the mentality they had. So they wanted, I mean, their whole attack vector was the carriers, and to then knock out everything else after. So there was that tension there, and the Japanese resolved it by saying, basically, do both. You know, that's how typically the Japanese resolve those type of you know, initiatives. You could make an argument, to be really honest, that, and there's no way the Japanese didn't prepare for this, they didn't plan for this, so this was impossible. But once the carriers weren't there and they had their first 2 waves, the Japanese should have went hunting for the U.S. carriers. Now, most people, you know, I mean, I think everyone rationally understands that was just not, they weren't built for that. They really were not built for thinking that, well, what if this isn't there? What are we going to do? What's our plan B? They didn't really have plan Bs. It was planned, you know, there's a famous line from Admiral Sprunis to say, you know, this was in the Battle of Coral Sea. Well, you know, what happens if the Japanese, counterattack us differently? And he says, no, they won't. They always have plan A, and then they double plan A, and then they have plan triple A, you know, so we can count on them to do that. Which is, you know, I mean, there were exceptions, but that was generally the rule. So let me put this on right now. All right. Let me know when you guys see this, and away we go. All right. Let's see here. All right. And I'll stop this at various stages based on your input. It's really good. Maybe 1 or 2 of you have seen this before. Important bulletin from the United. So, all right. Let me know. Make sure you guys can hear this well too. Did everyone hear that?
Just a second. Could I go back for a second?
Yeah.
So what were the carriers doing away from Pearl Harbor?
Yeah. So what they were doing, that's sorry, I didn't quite finish that. So because so basically Admiral Nimitz, it was sort of an interesting thing. We had our own little mini version of that lack of unified command too. It wasn't quite as bad as the Japanese at that point, and we eliminated that right after Pearl Harbor. But so Admiral Nimitz with the carriers, he was the carrier fleet commander. So he was responsible for all carriers that the U.S. Navy had, wherever they had them, and including the ones that were in dry dock getting developed. And so he basically had sold Admiral King, who was, just so you guys know, Admiral King is the General George Marshall of the Navy and of the Pacific also, really. It's important to see him that way. So he's a direct peer to General Marshall in World War II. And so Admiral Nimitz sold Admiral King on going out and doing proactive carrier training. So we're going to go and basically do red versus blue team type stuff against each other, and you know, sail parts of the Pacific, do flybys, just a ton of training, right? So this idea of carrier operations was already, in place and being built and being scaled. And one of the reasons he allowed Rear Admiral Halsey to split off to take a carrier down to Wake and to Midway was to reinforce it, to drop off some fighters, to drop off some men and materiel. Just as we viewed those places as tripwires, because we still had that belief that the Japanese were going to come through basically the South Central Pacific if they were dumb enough to attack. Which, by the way, is another reason why we were never going to stop this. Because even if we thought they were going to do this, we would have almost never thought they would have sailed all the way around basically the Northern Pacific, radio silent. So there's never nothing, but it's almost impossible to think how we could have stopped this outside of, sailing everything we had out in all directions, which you would never do from a resource standpoint, because you got to resupply it. So that's what Admiral Nimitz was doing with the carriers. And so does that answer your question or no?
Yep, good, thanks.
Yep. All right. So let me play this right now. And while I do that, once I play it, the first minute, let me go get some more water. So after that, I can stop and we can talk and stuff. Okay. Is that okay, guys? Just want to make sure you know.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good.
United Press, Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Stay tuned to WOR for further development.
1941, Japan situation. America and other nations have imposed an oil embargo on Japan, which means Japan cannot continue their conquests. No problem. Japan will just get the oil it needs from the Dutch Indies. Their underfunded and undergunned fleet will pose no threat to the Imperial Japanese Navy. And if their ally, Great Britain, joins the conflict, well, Japan will fight them too. Both nations are too occupied with the European war anyways. So, through their new conquests, Japan's demand for resources shall be met. However, geography has cursed them. Look at what lays beside their vital supply lines. The Philippines, a U.S. territory. Although America is not officially allied with the British and the Dutch, they are on friendly terms. Japan cannot afford the risk of the U.S. entering the war while they are in the midst of their campaign. Their proximity to Japan's supply lines puts into jeopardy everything they are about to fight for. Basically, the Americans would be holding a dagger to Japan's throat the entire time they conduct their campaign, ready to commence hostilities at a moment's notice. Thus, they come to the conclusion that they must take out the Americans as well. This calls not only for an invasion of the Philippines, but also a preemptive strike on the powerful American fleet at Pearl Harbor. And so with that, history was set. Japan set its powerful Kido Butai to strike Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th. Now, the goal of the raise was as follows. 1. Sink a battleship. This was for propaganda purposes. Japan reasoned that if America saw their beloved battleships, symbols of their naval power, destroyed, their will to wage war against Japan would be shattered as well. 2. Immobilize the fleet for 6 months. The Japanese estimated that they needed 6 months to do all their conquests. Then they would be on the defensive and await the American counterattacks and wear them down, culminating in a decisive naval clash. So note, the Japanese knew they could not win a long-term war with America, so Japanese strategy revolved on them waging a short-term war. This was why attacking the fuel tanks or naval facilities at Pearl Harbor was not even considered in the planning phase. It was irrelevant to the 6-month goal. At Pearl Harbor were some 80 ships. There were 8 battleships, 7 of them in battleship role and 1.
So I want to, I'm back here now. I just want to make sure, any questions on a lot of what we talked about already sort of leads up that first minute or two. Is that good for you guys, or any questions so far?
Aaron, one question.
Yes.
If assuming that fuel tanks were attacked and destroyed, for how long would it make effect on U.S. fleet operations?
Well, so that's actually a great question. So it's all tied to how much of the fleet is destroyed, right? So if you destroy, if you had just destroyed the tankers, I mean all well, the tankers too, because you need to destroy the oil tankers. If you destroyed the oil tankers and the depots, and let's pretend you didn't destroy any ships outside of that, you would hurt U.S. fleet operations for a while, because you'd have to rebuild those tanks and the tankers. Probably, I mean, the U.S. would sort of band-aid it by creating a oil tanker parking lot there, and so it would probably hurt our operations for like 3 months. And of course, if you destroyed the fleet, the tankers are sort of irrelevant for 6 to 12 months until you recast the fleet. The thing the Japanese never understood, and this is sort of the most important thing, it's the T-34 thing that the Soviets had, right? Or a bunch, or 5 or 10 T-34 kind of things, is the Japanese grossly miscalculated the scale of our naval buildup that had already started with the Two Ocean Naval Fleet Act of 1940. So the U.S. was building basically a light carrier basically every month. And then that became every week after Pearl Harbor. And then we were building a prime carrier at that point, roughly about every 3 months, and that became every month. So when the war finished, I mean, the numbers are just absurd. So when the war finished, the U.S. between light carriers, which, hold fewer planes, 20, usually 20 to, like 18 to 32 planes. And then full carriers, which hold usually 60, 80, 90 planes. The U.S. had about 106. I mean, when you think of what that is, it's just, these are just absurd numbers, right? I mean, it's just the ability of the U.S. to put basically, 4,000 planes on carriers across the Pacific. I mean, it's just, it's so the Japanese just never had any concept that we could industrialize our Navy. It basically like T-34 tanks, right? We were just rolling them out, whatever the peak T-34 is, like every, 10 minutes, another one came out, or 3 minutes or whatever. It's the same sort of principle. They just grossly misestimated that.
There is Admiral Yamamoto's famous statement about American industrial capacity. Did he not have any influence?
Oh no, he did. He had influence, and I mean, to be honest, in the spring. So in the spring, he was the person slowing it down. Basically getting them to cool their jets, because they were all gung ho. Some of them wanted to attack even early. I mean, the radicals wanted to attack like July, right? I mean, something absurd like that. So and he was always pretty clear about the fact that, you are just doing this. You're placing a bet that this is going to work to get the Americans to basically have a neutrality surrender and cut a deal between the Western and the Eastern Pacific, or the Central, the Western and Central Pacific for the Japanese, and what would be the Eastern Pacific for us. I mean, from our perspective, actually. It
sounds like a minor point, but Japanese ignorance of the U.S. appears to have been immense. How many officers, I don't know if you can answer this, how many Japanese officers had been to the U.S. that had any English?
So that's a great question. So Admiral Yamamoto studied at Harvard, actually. So he spent, he came to the U.S. several times. He loved the U.S. He came to the U.S. in the 1910s and 20s. There was an elite, right? That would be the best way to put it, an elite in Japanese society that had experience in the U.S. But what I would say is there's a difference between that and decision makers with hands-on sort of intelligence understanding, right? It's like if you compared a Soviet, NKVD, KGB type who spent years, under the wire here, looking for strategic intelligence and then feeding it back, to the Soviet, high command or intelligence, whatever. That's different than what the Japanese had, right? The Japanese did not have, man in the high castle type of, this sort of genius Jedi intelligence of what was going on the ground. They understood these sort of large arcs, right? Where, and they would have piece parts, right? They would have random piece parts of intelligence. They really devoured our open source media that we had, of course. And we sort of forget that today, but the internet of that period was newspapers. I mean, the United States had, I don't know, it was some crazy number, like 10, 20,000 newspapers then, right? So, you could glean a decent chunk of open source intelligence from newspapers. But they also just had this, there's a psychological term for it. Well, it's basically a confirmation bias, but they had this sort of a bias built into what they already understood. So they were not looking for the deviance within that. They were not looking for, so when they would learn that we're building additional ships and carriers in Seattle, which was basically where we built them, or the majority of them, that would really never factor all the way back into their plan on how to deal with our carrier fleet, right? It was this sort of weird disconnect, which, was never really reconciled.
If there are two things I can add, there's also a disconnect in terms of the people who'd been to America and the people who were leading the Japanese Navy at this point, right? So you have a lot of the founders of Imperial Japan during the Meiji era who had spent serious time in the United States, and a lot of the diplomats, especially in Komoe. Komoe was the prime minister who resigned in November of 1941 because he was unable to prevent Pearl Harbor from occurring, right?
Yeah.
He knew that it was going to happen. He didn't want it to happen on his watch because he didn't think it was a good decision. And that's when Tojo Hideki became prime minister of Japan.
Yeah.
But that generation that was at Komoe's level, most of them had been to America or understood America at some sort of cultural level, maybe not at an industrial level, but at a cultural level, they understood America. The leaders in the Navy, as Aaron points out, are much younger individuals. We're talking about a generational difference. And they either, if they had been to America, they had been there in a very sort of sheltered capacity, but most of them were sort of believing this idea that Japan was somehow superior. So you have this sort of disconnect. The second issue, I'm trying to remember what I was going to say, was that it'll come back to me later.
Okay, let me just.
Were the Japanese like the Russians? Is that having foreign experience made you an object of suspicion?
No, but okay, I remember the second part. The second part is that, as Aaron pointed out, they got a lot of newspapers from the United States. And one of the things that most Japanese who'd been to America were consistently struck with was how divided American public opinion was. Like this didn't, especially to the ultra-nationalists who believed in one Japan, one identity. This idea of multiple conflicting perceptions of reality and different political views and people protesting and marches and a hugely divided populace. Their view was that it would take a lot for America to unite. It would require some sort of alien invasion for them to unite. Like a small attack, it might bring America into the war, but even if it did, there'd be huge disruption within the United States, and there'd be a huge anti-war movement. Like, from the Japanese perception, the idea of a United States in the united sense of the term was not something that they actually believed was true. And you can look at, I forget his name, I think it's Kosuru. He was the one who was the diplomat to Washington and also previously had signed the tripartite agreement with Hitler and the Italian emissary. He spent a long time in America, and he consistently wrote about how divided America was and how he found it astounding that the country even functioned.
We still do. We wonder about that.
Okay, so let me just suggest the more recent scholarship is not as high on Yamamoto as previous ones. Part of the thing is, it wasn't just the person who Richard mentioned, who I don't even know, who was opposed to the plan. Nagano, who was the head of the Navy, he was opposed to the plan too. And the way Yamamoto got this plan passed was he threatened to resign. Okay, so he was big on the Pearl Harbor thing. I don't, the previous scholarship has led us to believe because he came to America, he thought, I can give you 6 months, which he didn't even do because the duel already took place in 4 months. But this was big for him. This was something that he wanted, and he got it. And he'll threaten the same thing before Midway too. So more recent scholarship is not saying that Yamamoto was this great genius. He's a gambler, and this is a big gamble, and he takes it and it fails. It wins at Pearl Harbor, but he'll do the same thing at Midway. It'll fail. And when he's dead, the Japanese will try it again at Leyte Gulf. These operations are just too complicated. This one works, and it gets into their heads that it'll work.
Yeah. So one thing to recognize, this goes back to, and I know we talked a couple months ago about modern naval strategy. The whole concept of Mahanian sort of strategy. The Japanese truly believed in their Navy in what's called decisive operations. And if you remember the beginning of the presentation, that's why I used that, because that is this sort of concept of, very, you could almost look at it in sort of a Napoleonic terms. You create this massive event that you win, and it's decisive. And that's this sort of, we win, you lose, done. Instead of, clearly in the more modern sense, there's very few individually decisive operations. The more modern your war fighting has become in the last let's say 50 to 100 years. And now others can try to make that happen, and if they do, especially if you're at a disadvantage, then you're just putting yourself at a greater risk. And the Japanese, obviously, in that position, which they understood they were not going to withstand, peer to peer, because the U.S. economy, this is something to recognize too, the U.S. economy was about 10 times bigger than the Japanese economy at that point. It's and they knew that, right? Or at least enough people knew that. So that's a dynamic where they were locked into a doctrine, and they just kept going back to it over and over and over again, which was creating decisive operations one after the other. And obviously they were able to make that work with smaller, fragile, remote, kind of colonial outposts or powers, or very weakened, fractured, regional powers, like whether in Manchuria or in China. But when they came up against, basically a peer or a near peer power, that's a very dangerous gamble. Oh, and one other quick point on where the carriers were. So to be very explicit, so the Enterprise, which was which I told you guys earlier, Admiral Hall, or what do you call it, Vice Admiral Halsey, he just had gotten promoted. His job was to ferry a squadron of Wildcats to Wake Island, and then basically sail back. So on the dawn of December 7th, his Task Force 8, which was about 20 ships, and the carrier Enterprise was about 215 miles west of Oahu. The Lexington, which was Task Force 12, they basically, their job was to put 18 Avant bombers to Midway. And then on the dawn of December 7th, they were about 500 miles southwest of Midway. And then the Saratoga, which had just finished a overhaul at Puget Sound Naval Yard, which is basically, that's where our carriers were basically built in, was either there or in San Diego on North Island, if you know where that is. So she was on her way out to Pearl, and she had just picked up the Marine Fighter Air Wing, fully loaded up, and then the Yorktown, also with the escort carrier Long Island, was coming over from the from the Atlantic, and then the Hornet, which was just commissioned. It was on its shakedown mission, which is sort of its its training phase. So that's where all the carriers were, and of course the Japanese, and of course they were all sailing radio silent too. So the Japanese could never, have known that. I mean, outside of flying some kind of weird nighttime reconnaissance mission, which could have put the whole mission at risk, or they did, and we'll see this, bring in these little pocket submarines, these little kind of mini subs, like 2-3 person subs. Outside of doing something like that, there's really no other way they could have figured out where the carriers were, or if they were there or not. So let me get back to kind of how Pearl was laid out here. And then you guys stop me at any point, please.
1 in dry dock. 8 cruisers were at Pearl Harbor.
Sorry, let me just go back here for a second.
Attacking the fuel tanks or naval facilities at Pearl Harbor was not even considered in the planning phase. It was irrelevant to the 6-month goal. At Pearl Harbor were some 80 ships. There were 8 battleships, 7 of them in battleship role and 1 in dry dock. 8 cruisers were at Pearl Harbor, 4 of which were accessible to torpedoes, and dozens of destroyers and auxiliaries were docked elsewhere. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the 3 American carriers were all at sea and not in port that fateful day. The attack on Pearl Harbor would be carried out by 6 fleet carriers and its strike force of 350 planes. Their crews had endured 10 months of training for this attack. In addition, 5 midget submarines would be tasked with penetrating the harbor and attacking in conjunction with the main airstrike. The attack would be composed of 2 waves. During the first wave, Lieutenant Fuchida commanded the strike against the ships in the harbor. The key to the first wave was the 50 level bombers and 40 torpedo bombers, also known as Kates. Their torpedoes had been modified with wooden fins so that they could be effective in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Their priority targets were the battleships and carriers at port. The first wave of 183 aircraft was launched at 6 a.m. The strike force approached Oahu, and soon the formation separated into groups to attack their assigned airfields and targets. The sky was completely clear of American fighters. The Japanese had achieved complete surprise. The dive bombers beat the torpedo bombers to Pearl Harbor, the first bombs hitting the southern tip of Ford Island minutes before even the first torpedo had been launched. Planes from Hiru and Soryu approached at 7:55. They were disappointed to discover that their targets, the carriers, were not in port that day. Lieutenant Nagai, leader of Soryu's air group, realized there were no potential targets, so he and his wingman pulled off. However, the remaining 6 attacked. They probably mistook the OT commissioned battleship, the USS Utah, as a capital ship, and they fired upon her. 2 torpedoes slammed into her before 8 a.m. The rest missed. One missed so badly that the USS Raleigh was hit. The Utah capsized at 8:12. The Raleigh almost suffered a similar fate, but prompt damage control prevented her from capsizing. Nagai went around Ford Island and launched against what he believed was a battleship. In reality, it was just a cruiser, the USS Helena. She was double-berthed with an old mine layer, the Ogallala. Its silhouette probably gave the impression of a battleship. His torpedo actually went under Ogallala's heel and exploded into Helena's hull, damaging both ships. Nagai's wingman recognized that it was just a cruiser and decided to attack Battleship Row instead. The 8 Hiru planes didn't fare any better. Lieutenant Hirata and his wingman saw that there were no viable targets, so they headed for Battleship Row. However, the remaining 6 aircraft who were lagging behind got to see Nagai's attack on Helena and followed suit. 4 launched torpedoes, but they all missed terribly. The last pair aborted their run at the last minute and headed for the battleships. So now we have 4 Hiru and 1 Soryu plane maneuvering for Battleship Row, cutting right across the path of the other 24 torpedo bombers who are just coming in. In this photograph, you can see the opening stages of the attack. Both the Utah and Raleigh have been hit, and Utah is listing to port. At this moment, the torpedo runs against the battleships have begun. You can even spot 2 planes finishing their bomb runs. Due to the geography of Pearl Harbor, the torpedo bombers really just had one avenue of approach. If they had gone over the naval buildings, the turbulence would have thrown off their accuracy and limited their launch window. Therefore, the overwhelming majority of the Cape bombers flew single file down the southeast lock. The result was that instead of the attack being spread out, it would be disproportionately concentrated on the southern tip of Battleship Row, much to Oklahoma's and West Virginia's despair. 12 Akagi planes approached single file, 1,000 feet apart, starting at 7:57. All of Akagi's 12 planes launched against these 2 battleships, except one, which skillfully maneuvered and struck the California. The 4 Hiru planes from before joined shortly afterwards and launched against Oklahoma and West Virginia. Contrary to belief, the Japanese were not attacking with impunity. The defenders had taken advantage of the precious minutes warning afforded by the Fort Allen bomb blast, so that when the first torpedo planes of Akagi approached, many anti-aircraft gunners were already prepared. These vulnerable, slow-moving Kates had to make their torpedo runs under fire. 3 miles behind Akagi's strike was Kaga's air group. By now, the anti-aircraft fire was becoming more effective, and again, Oklahoma and West Virginia took the brunt of the attack. In the middle of their launch, that single Soryu plane from earlier swept in and got a hit on the California. However, one of Kaga's plane veered to the right because of this, but was able to hit the Nevada at 8:03. Kaga's air group was the only one to suffer losses. 5 of the last 7 attacking Kates were shot down. In this historic photograph, the torpedo attack is perfectly captured. You can see the torpedo hits on the Oklahoma, West Virginia, and the California. All of them are gushing out oil. In the background, you can see Hickam Field burning, and the Helena can be seen leaning against the Oglala. And a Japanese plane can also be spotted. However, the attack wasn't executed as smoothly as hoped. An attack that should have taken less than 90 seconds stretched out over 11 minutes from first run to last. Some had to abort and redo their runs due to mutual interference, and the heavy anti-aircraft fire threw off the pilot's aim and caused them to over-concentrate on just 2 battleships. 21 torpedoes were launched at Oklahoma and West Virginia, over half of the available torpedoes. Oklahoma had 12 torpedoes launched at her. 5 hit her, and she capsized in 15 minutes. West Virginia was hit by 7 torpedoes, but prompt counterflooding prevented her from capsizing, and she settled to the bottom. California should not have sunk from 2 torpedoes, but her hatches were open for inspection that morning, which contributed to her sinking. And she was abandoned due to fires, and when she was reboarded, it was too late. Of the 36 torpedoes launched, only 19 achieved hits. That's a 48% hit rate. 10,000 feet above came Fuchida and his high-level bombers. Their mission was to take out the inboard battleships inaccessible to torpedoes. They came in groups of 5. They released their salvos and scored an impressive 20% hit rate. Unfortunately for the Japanese, out of the 10 bomb hits, about 6 were low-order detonations or malfunctions. That is an outrageous 60% dud rate. The Japanese aviators were greatly let down by their weaponry. The damage could have been deadlier. However, the distribution was effective. California was missed, but 2 ineffective hits on Maryland were scored. Both West Virginia and the Tennessee were hit twice, and there were 2 additional collateral damage hits on the repair ship Vestal, moored outboard of the Arizona. Vestal suffered severe flooding and had to be beached afterwards. But all of these hits were overshadowed by the 2 hits on the USS Arizona. The first struck her aft on the quarterdeck, and another landed near her number 2 turret. It caused a magazine explosion, which exploded with a great force, and a tremendous fireball was seen. She split in half and sunk in the harbor, taking more than 1,000 sailors with her. Heavy fires burned for days. The explosion was actually caught on tape by Dr. Hackinson, who was on the hospital ship Solace. Nevada was the only battleship not suffering heavy damage and capable of getting underway. She did so at 8:40 with the intention of heading out of the channel. Now, one of the mini-subs actually did make it into the harbor. The other 4 were unsuccessful. At 8:36, the sea tender, the USS Curtis, spotted a sub. The submarine fired at Curtis but missed. In return, the submarine was hit by a 5-inch shell. The destroyer Monaghan, which happened to be getting underway at this moment, saw the sub and approached with the intent to ram her. The sub turned and fired its last torpedo, which missed the destroyer. At 8:40, the sub was rammed and depth charged. She sunk with both crew members killed. 167 planes for.
Okay, so before we get the second
Smash
wave,
Washington.
oh shoot, sorry. Sorry about that. Let me go fix that. So before we get to the second wave, any questions on the first wave so far?
I was surprised a little bit about the 60% dud rate. Do you have any sort of insight as to why the Japanese weapons had such a high failure rate?
I mean, to be honest, the manufacturing, which of course sounds ridiculous now, given that Japan's arguably the greatest quality control-based manufacturer in history, the last 50, 60 years, or at least the last 50 years. They had, throughout the war, they had enormous quality control challenges with their weaponry, with the armaments, their factories, testing. I mean, and also just like at a procedural level. So they would spend an enormous amount of energy in doing basically mock-ups, right? Like what we would call walkthroughs now. But they would rarely test it on actual weaponry. And so, that meant often, and that a lot of that was built around this idea of not wasting resources, which, sort of made sense. But when you're taking on something this, at such a critical level, you would think you'd want to test it all out, test it. The normal way you would do this is you'd build different batches and then test them. And if you started to see some variability, you would, go back through your manufacturing process until till you got rid of that, until you got, a good enough rate. But they just never really figured that out. It was always this gap that they had, throughout the whole war, really, for that matter.
Okay, let me just add to that. Another problem they had, they didn't have bombs that size at the start of the war, so they converted 16-inch naval shells into bombs.
No, that's true.
And that's probably
true.
has something to do with the dud rate.
No, it did, but you could still test that. You know what I mean? Like and especially if you were trying to innovate, right? You would want to validate that this works. And they just skipped over these steps. I mean, they over time sort of learned, they would sometimes figure that out, but it just wasn't built into the culture, really. Which, to be honest, I'd say the US had a huge advantage in that. The US would just test everything to death. I mean, a lot of it was our capacity, obviously. We could just build more, but we just constantly did that over and over again. And the more complicated it was, the more we did that. If that makes sense. So any other questions on the first
I
wave?
find that very surprising because the Japanese Zero was the best plane in at least the Pacific.
Absolutely. In the beginning of the war, it was the best. It was the best plane, sure.
So the aircraft engineers knew how to do it, and the bomb engineers.
No, that's a good way to put it. Is that the aircraft and understand that it's sort of this weird dynamic they had too, where the U.S. had tremendous integration. So if you were building a P-51, you would have flight training of your senior pilots right by where you were building it. You'd have ordnance and sort of weaponry training right by it, and testing, and which obviously the Soviets had a very similar system too, which just gave you this improvement, this sort of value chain, this speed to market that we would call now. the Japanese really kept these things separate, and a lot of it had to do with, we talked a few months ago about the different state-owned companies that built these different parts of the war machine, and they were very, very protective of their separate sort of interests. Whereas, you just didn't obviously have that in the Soviet Union, and I mean, I'm sure you had a little bit of it everywhere, but you ultimately didn't have enough of it in the Soviet Union or the United States to make a difference like it did, especially for a mission like this, especially given the planning and training they went through, the preparedness for this. I mean, it's sort of like they literally did get like 90% of this right, except for plan Bs and good ordnance, which is pretty important. So, any other questions?
Just let me add something though. The Zero is a great plane for its time, but it has problems. The Japanese are interested in speed. It has no protection. They don't have self-sealing fuel tanks. So if a round hits it in the tank, it's going to catch fire pretty quickly. It's a really maneuverable airplane, but even the 20-millimeter cannon, for which it gets so much credit, it only carries like 60 rounds. So once those go pretty quick, and in a dogfight, you just put your finger on the trigger and you're firing a whole bunch of them. They run out of that quickly, and then they only have 2 machine guns, and that's not going to work against fighters that have 6, which is basically American fighters. So yes, it looks really good early in the war. Interestingly, an interesting tidbit, supposedly the first Zero that shot out of the sky by another airplane is over Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and actually, the first Zero was shot out of the sky by a very famous, he won the Naval Cross and the Purple Heart, Doris Miller, who's
right.
who actually,
yes.
Yeah, who actually has there's a U.S. carrier. There's a new U.S. carrier named for him. He's the first Black American member of the Navy with a U.S. carrier named after him. So he has a USN. I forgot what it is now, like USN, whatever, 92 or whatever. And that's sort of if you ever see the movie Pearl Harbor or any kind of reconstruction of it, you'll always find, this kind of big buff Black guy that is always manning a twin 50 caliber or 20-millimeter machine gun at various stages. And, he's sort of putting the anti-aircraft counterattack, on his back, and which is true. I mean, he literally did that. So he's actually he's credited with the first Zero kill in World War II, and then he got another one on the Indianapolis, because he was on the Indianapolis in World War II also, when he went back out into the Pacific. So anyways, I have a little kind of
one more thing. It was probably very important because we talked about this with tanks. The radios don't work. The Zeros, to the point where the pilots who are not flying off carriers, because when you're flying off a carrier, you need to know where your people are, so you want to make them work. But the guys who are land-based with Zeros, they take the radios out. They just don't work.
Well, and this is a larger thing that the Japanese had in World War II, right? The larger communications, if you're going to be really objective about it, for the power that Japan was, its communications, its military communications technology, and even its civilian, were incredibly antiquated. By the standards of that period, and they had access to German communications equipment, cross licensing, etc. They really didn't build that as a advanced priority. And if there's one thing I would be really objective about this, is that the U.S. really got right in World War II across all its forces, was its communications, and how it integrated its communications relative to that era, especially where you had in various places, you had tankers, so let's say you had a tank company with 6 or 8 tanks. The lead tank or the command tank would have a second radio. That radio would be on an Army Air Corps channel to those squadrons that would be flying those, let's say, P-51s for close air support, and they'd be integrated with the artillery, which would also be on an aviation channel. and on the tank and land army channel, which also meant you had to add a lot more people in those roles. But it allowed you to have really integrated communications, which could make a big difference, obviously.
Aaron, two questions.
Yep.
In particular to this situation, and I know if this is applicable, but in them attacking the Pearl Harbor, was there any of the amount or percentage of the plane that they were told that to commit kamikaze rams?
No. So the kamikazing that people assumed to kamikaze, that didn't start really in any significant way for another couple of years. So you had a few random, and humans do this, right? You would have a random pilot that was shot up themselves and their plane, and they would say the hell with it and go for it. That would happen. It happened with the US pilot randomly, a Japanese pilot, German pilot, Russian pilot, just anyone in that role. And I don't think was that innovative. But in terms of a designed approach to kamikazes, that really wasn't a real thing until 44. And where it was sort of tested out in the islands, in smaller islands, in Tinian, but where it really blew up, no pun intended, is in Okinawa. So Okinawa, there was 1,500 kamikazes in Okinawa. So that's one of the things that really transformed our planning for the invasion of the main islands, was what we were expecting, because the Japanese ultimately wanted 15,000 kamikazes ready for the invasion to basically sink, let's say, half of our combat fleet that we'd have to surround it with, which probably would have worked. I mean, or at least, it had a pretty bad damage to it. And then you add all the other kamikazes they had, because they didn't just have kamikaze planes. They had the equivalent of frogmen, who would have 30, 50 pound, kind of, of TNT or Comp B, basically explosives. They'd have little boats. They had their little submarines. I mean, they were, they ultimately, by the end of the war, were going to, their goal was having, basically 50,000 kamikaze-ish, attacks against our naval fleet around, all of Japan, which we would have had at that point probably 800 to about 1,200 combat ships and another 3,000 supporting ships and maybe 10,000 other large boats. And so they just would have been slamming against that, for months. So that's what the Navy was expecting by 45, obviously, but that wasn't 1941 or 42 at all, anywhere.
And then the second question I have is, we all know about Richard Zorge, basically working as a journalist attached to the German, attaché embassy. But was there any, even from the Russians, kind of like a clue to United States, like, look, there's something happening. You guys gotta get prepared.
No.
Like the way they were giving it, the English was telling about the Barbarossa to Russians.
Yeah, I mean, so what you have to realize is there was the only thing that really existed, and it made sense, is that we had broken JN25. So there was JN25 like A through E, I think is what it is. Yeah, A through E or A through D. These are like different channels that the Japanese had. And we had broken the diplomatic channel. And so we picked that up. As the war went on, we kept breaking those channels. Sometimes the Japanese would switch them, not because they ever knew we broke the channels. They never knew this. When we talked to them after the war, there's a famous meeting of some U.S. intelligence officers talking to Japanese commanders in Japan, telling them all the stuff that we knew when we were interrogating them, and they had no idea we knew this until we explained, well, we'd already broken this is when we broke all these channels, and it sort of freaked them out, actually, for obvious reasons. So we didn't have, so that was really what we broke, was that. I mean, obviously the disposition of forces, I mean, you could see where, they have Navy ships or, in general proximity, because you need coaling stations, you need fueling stations, you need maintenance stations. And then there was the logic to the Japanese taking over the Pacific and what made sense. And what made sense to everybody was the Philippines, which, the Japanese, hit the Philippines also. And they hit Wake and they hit Midway. They hit, I think it was 14. Yeah, they hit within a few weeks, basically within a week, they basically hit 14 different locations that the U.S. had any forces. And then within 97 days, they basically had taken over that big red circle that everyone sees, which really is the greatest conquering of space, because obviously ocean is space, it's not land, but of space in history in terms of magnitude. So
there was an interesting fact. I remember going to Hawaii, and I went to one of the ships. I don't remember which one it was, but they have chilling letters that the kamikaze wrote on last day before they,
absolutely
a mission to their relatives.
Yep.
And absolutely, like the chills go through you. And they write such a most intelligent, language as like, mom, make sure you take care of the plant type, I did here. And I mean, they knew that they were going to that. Another thing is interesting is when one of the kamikaze rammed the boats, General MacArthur actually, gave him honors and buried him with honors with and with alkalides. And everybody asked him, why did you do that? He's trying to destroy our boats. He goes like, I expect them to do the same thing. Just, if we do something like that, I expect them to give him the, honor. To
I mean, MacArthur was just a different animal, so it's, he was this, he lived in 20 different eras in his head. And so the majority, I mean, to be very blunt, if you want to really know the average relationship to a US to Japanese or vice versa, when the US would sink a Japanese tender of any kind and people would abandon ship and they would be floating around, the US would basically take our ship, and guys would have small arms, Thompson machine guns, M1 Garands, et cetera, and we would just shoot the Japanese in the water. I mean, some of that was probably because, well, they were likely to die anyways, but a lot of it was just, the feeling we had at that point. So that was far more normal of a response at that point. So without further ado, let me get back to the second wave here. And any other questions or ready to go?
Go ahead.
Okay, great.
167 planes formed the attack of the second wave, of which 78 were dive bombers allocated to go against warships. Much was expected from these skilled pilots. However, their performance was disappointing. First, take a moment to see what they were up against. By now, the anti-aircraft defenses were up and ready to greet the dive bombers. Couple this with the fact that there was a 70 to 90% low overcast, their accuracy was destined to be off. But most importantly, these pilots were guilty of poor target selection. This was their priority list. These dive bombers with their general purpose bombs were well suited for attacking the 8 cruisers left in Pearl Harbor. But during the attack, about roughly 30 attack battleships, only 17 went for cruisers, 16 attacked destroyers, and 12 attacked auxiliaries. The attack began at 8:54. The USS Nevada was caught in its escape during the second wave. The prospect of sinking the ship in the channel and thus blocking access to Pearl Harbor was a very, very improbable outcome. However, the pilots couldn't resist the opportunity, so they attacked from 2 directions. 14 to 18 valves dropped against Nevada. Nevada was hit 5 times by 9 o'clock. And at 9:10, she had to beach herself. This was the shining moment of the second wave. But it deserves to be criticized. Did they contribute to sinking a battleship? Yeah, but it was by the rarest of luck. Nevada succumbed not to Japanese bombs, but to poor material condition, critical design flaws, and a massively significant damage control mistake. And again, it still doesn't make it any wiser. The battleship should have been avoided. The attempt to sink Nevada in the channel was a waste of ordnance that could have been better employed against targets more vulnerable to their effects. 1 to 3 dive bombers went for California, scoring 1 hit. The USS Pennsylvania, the fleet's flagship, the only battleship in dock, was also poorly selected. 9 bombers went after her. She suffered only a single hit at 9:06. The real victims, though, were the 2 destroyers ahead of her, which received collateral damage. 2 hit the Cassin and 1 hit the Downs, heavily damaging both. So there could be a cultural explanation to why the Japanese pilots went for battleships. These young 20-year-old pilots were going into the most significant battle in Japan's history. No one wanted to go back home and report that they attacked a simple cruiser or a destroyer. No way. They wanted to go for battleships, sticking true to their samurai spirit. But overall, the second wave attack was just scattered throughout Pearl Harbor, with many attacks missing their targets. A puzzling target selection was the destroyer USS Shaw, which was targeted by as many as 15 bombers. 3 bombs hit her, one of which unleashed a tremendous fireball. The reason to her being targeted was probably because she was in a floating dry dock and resembled a capital ship. On the west side, the Curtis, a sea tender, was inexplicably targeted. A damaged FAL committed a suicide dive and crashed into her, and minutes later, she was hit by a bomb. And lastly, the only hit on a top priority target was on the Raleigh. As many as 5 dive bombers went for her, still listing from that torpedo hit. She was hit once at 9:08. Also, we can add a near miss on the Honolulu, which caused minor damage. So only 1 hit and 1 damage near miss were achieved on the dive bomber's highest priority targets. Against the 55% accuracy rate achieved during their training, the pilots got only 15 hits. That's a rather disappointing 19% hit rate. It was a poor performance of the second wave. It contributed nothing substantial to the fleet in Pearl Harbor. Also, as in the case of the armor-piercing bombs, the general-purpose bombs were deficient. But the second wave had the opportunity to be more damaging. Take, for example, the Phoenix here, a modern cruiser which was completely ignored by the second wave, not to mention the first wave of torpedo bombers. She was a suitable target. But even more telling was the fact that the naval yard was basically ignored. 4 modern 10-ton cruisers were tied up here, all of them packed so closely together. One could hardly have missed anything of value had the attack been concentrated here. On top of this, these ships were in a very vulnerable position. Flammable materials were scattered throughout, hatches were open, fire management systems might have been isolated. A bomb hit here would have caused a tremendous fire and been particularly devastating. And there was no smoke around this area at all. The Japanese missed a chance to deliver a more effective blow. Only about 10 dive bombers attacked this area, and as previously mentioned, only a damaged near miss caused any damage whatsoever. By 9:30, the attack was over. The attack left behind 2,335 people dead and another 1,178 wounded. Civilian casualties totaled 103, including 68 dead. 5 battleships have been sunk, but only 2 were permanent losses, the Arizona and the Oklahoma. The rest were repaired and served before the war's end. The other 3 battleships at Pearl Harbor suffered light damage. However, this attack didn't really cripple the Pacific Fleet. Soon, the Japanese would realize that it wasn't these old, obsolete battleships that posed the real danger to them. It was the carriers that they had missed. They would soon feel their vengeance half a year later. To the list, we can add a target ship and a mine layer, and the repair ship Vestal, which was beached. There was heavy to moderate damage to 3 destroyers, 2 light cruisers, and a sea tender. And there was light damage to a light cruiser. The Japanese also achieved great success on their strikes on the airfield spread out on Oahu. Over 160 planes were destroyed. They destroyed 2 to 3 times the number of aircraft that they had expected. The Japanese lost only 29 planes, 9 in the first wave, 20 in the second wave, a testament to the Americans' quick air defense. Also, none of Japan's 5 midget submarines made it back. Was the mission accomplished? Well, yes. All 4 battleships hit by torpedoes were out of the war for 6 months or more, and they had sunk 1 other battleship by bombs alone. And with that, the Kido Butai sailed back home, unscathed. World War II had just started for America, and the sneak attack left behind a temporary shocked nation, but a nation that afterwards would be resolved to finish the war with nothing less than a total victory on their side. The Japanese had awoken a sleeping giant.
Okay, let me get back to the deck here. Any questions while I get back to the deck?
I find this very puzzling. So it sounds like the Japanese didn't have very good information as to where the ships were in the harbor, and they expected the pilots to find them.
Well, I mean, so that was very normal to that era, right? I mean, it isn't, you didn't have modern, obviously you didn't have satellite intelligence. You barely had what you would call radio communications intelligence. And especially when it came to the disposition of naval forces in a harbor, I mean, you tend to construct a harbor around your naval harbor around your needs in the harbor. So it's pretty clear where your battleships are going to be serviced, your cruisers, your destroyers, your tender support ships, auxiliaries. And then if you have aircraft carriers, right, you need typically with aircraft carriers, you need a space that can allow the carrier to turn 360 degrees so that you can actually service the carrier, completely. So it's not that it's not that they didn't understand the layout of Pearl Harbor. They did, obviously, by their creation of their torpedoes and creating mid-high level bombers. But it's the fact of where those forces were going to be at that point in time. That was always going to be somewhat of a guess. I mean, the likelihood that the fleet, 80 ships plus or 100, whatever, would have been out at sea is 0. So they knew they were going to have a large group of ships. And then whatever their open source intelligence was, newspaper clippings, things like that, they knew they had captured enough information to know which ships were in Pearl or supposed to be in Pearl to get serviced, et cetera. So, I mean, for 1941, I would say this is a pretty, and given you're going across an ocean, right? It's not a land bridge where you can sneak people in and out and all this stuff. I would say they had, pretty decent intelligence for 1941, given the mission they had against an island.
No, I'm just asking something. Were the individual pilots on their own for target selection, or would the squad?
No, not at all. No, this was,
who was making the decisions as to who attacked what?
Yeah, so Admiral Genda, all the way down to Kigali, to all of the lead commanders, made all of the target selection, and most of that target selection was made all the way back into Tokyo, in terms of, because they'd been planning this for really, let's say exhaustively planning for 6 months and starting the process for about 10 months. So they really, and of course they trained, they assigned squadrons, to the most accurate and specific pilots that could follow the mission template as exhaustively as they could. So this was not a sort of random, let's go for it and see what happens a type of mission. This was, something that was very, very, explicitly planned. Oops, sorry about that. I don't know what that was. So in any other questions there? Or?
Just let me add, this is their first major mission. They've flown against the Chinese, but the Chinese don't have a Navy.
Yep.
So this is the first time they're getting shot at, and it affected
Absolutely.
someone.
No, absolutely, of course. And let's be honest about the response, right? The U.S. was able, and this was all, literally petty officers, for the most part, were able to get up anti-aircraft fire, extremely quickly. I mean, a matter of, seconds to minutes. And so, it's one of the reasons that anyone that thinks a third wave would have made any sense, it's just once they knew the carriers weren't there, when the U.S. was getting its anti-aircraft fire up, it really meant that, the next wave, they probably would have lost, 30, 40, 50 planes at least, if not more. So, so that's something that, is pretty significant there. Any other questions on that first part there?
Aaron, please clarify, did they initially plan a third wave or not?
Well, yeah. So there was always a significant conversation on to have a third wave, and then at that time, even Yamamoto. So there was a significant conversation on board, right? The young pilots obviously wanted to have 10 waves, right? Whatever. And so the overall fleet commander, or the overall task force commander, did not want to jeopardize more planes, and more importantly, a response. Once they knew the carriers, and it's actually pretty rational. Once they knew the carriers weren't there, they obviously, the Americans knew that, Pearl Harbor had been hit, and the carriers knew the Pearl Harbor had been hit. That you were now walking into this, you were moving out of this sort of surprise attack into this blow by blow attack, and the Japanese weren't necessarily ready for that. And so, even though looking back in retrospect, there's no way they could have known this, but they were actually, that was their peak. They were actually most ready to go after and try to sink our carriers right then and there. But they didn't know that, and there's no way that they could have known that, obviously.
Thanks.
All right. So any other questions? So one thing I want to show you guys here, and I think most of you, I don't know, most of you might have seen this before. This is the next, let me pull this up here real quick. Sorry, just give me a second here. Sorry, just give me one more second. Let me know when you can see my see my screen here. All right. So obviously this was a shock across the United States, and really the whole world for that matter. And let me pull this up here. Let me know when you guys see this. So FDR signs his war declaration, and then this is, and many of you might not have seen this, but I think it's worth seeing. It's like a few minutes, but this is FDR the next day, giving a full speech on it, which is like a few minutes. Right, sort of cherry picked I got the clip of it basically.
Senators and representatives, I have the distinguished honor of presenting the President of the United States.
Oh, sorry, let me just get to full screen here. Sorry, just give me a second.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense. But always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
So that brings us into the war with Japan, and obviously the Japanese were not expecting probably that response after Pearl Harbor. One other thing I want to show you guys, or I want to talk you through here is.
I just want to ask one question. What was that line about ships being sunk between San Francisco and Hawaii?
Yeah, so a lot of people don't know
just-
this. Yeah, a lot of people don't know this, but there's the Japanese had a fantastic diesel submarine called the B-1, not to be confused with that. And if you're old enough and you've been here long enough, this is a 1970s joke. That fantastic B-1 bomber of the 1970s and 80s that ultimately got sort of retrofitted and has turned into a pretty good bomber now. But so the B-1 submarine, which was it was a really effective submarine. It carried a huge amount of ordnance, submarine torpedoes. But what made it extremely unique is it carried a plane, which was called the Glenn. That's what we called it, which wasn't a very fast plane. It flew about 100 miles an hour. But it carried armaments. You could have small bombs, basically small depth charges to attack other submarines. You carry small torpedoes. You could just create some chaos. So the Japanese, as part of this strategy, there was so remember I told you there was sort of a compromise, because there was always a compromise between the group that wanted to attack Pearl Harbor and the group that didn't want to attack Pearl Harbor, or let's just say didn't want to prioritize that. Well, when that group lost, they said, well, if we're going to do this, we should have additional submarines put in place in the Pacific, which they sailed earlier. They sailed them a couple weeks earlier, and these submarines were actually pretty fast submarines. They could cruise at 15 to 20 knots, which for that era was a pretty good submarine, and carried almost 1,000 tons of diesel fuel. I mean, it was a really well-made submarine, and so they had about a dozen of these that were parked off of San Francisco, the Bay of San Francisco, and they sunk some merchant ships. Their plan was, and they also carried a 5-inch gun. So their plan was to bombard San Francisco with incineration shells, basically try to start fires. Which it wouldn't have destroyed San Francisco, obviously, but it would have it would have been shocking. And then more importantly, once it became clear on December 7th that that the Japanese missed the carriers, they then stated they only wanted to keep 8 of those subs in the greater San Francisco area and send 4 going off looking for the carriers, because they still wanted to kind of have a shock value attack, and if they got lucky, get some naval forces. They did have some bad intelligence. It's bad intelligence, I guess. They never understood, and this was they eventually did, but they never understood at this point that in the West, the US had really moved its development of ships to Puget Sound and to North Island in San Diego from San Francisco. For really a long time, we built the majority of our ships in San Francisco in the West Coast. It was actually shipbuilding. It was like Norfolk, really. And then we moved that as San Francisco became more commercialized. And Seattle back then, Puget Sound was, basically a small town, really. And so that's this sort of shift that they missed, intelligence wise. So that's just a couple of tidbits that most people aren't aware of. That's pretty interesting.
Aaron, how was the plane put on submarine? Was it
so so it's pretty awesome. I mean, you can read about it. You can basically read about, it's called the B-1. It's a submarine hangar. They created the first submarine hangar. It was an onboard hangar. It was in an airtight separate compartment. The wings did what's called a butterfly close. So if you ever look at how butterflies, they'll kind of like arch their back and put their wings up. They basically designed the wings on the planes to do that. They had floats that were, that you could take off. So basically it had it's basically like a half-baked crane, which was an attachment. It basically a lot of dual use. This was actually a really well-designed submarine. You could put the crane attachment on the 5-inch gun platform, so that you just move the crane around, and basically you could move the plane into the water, and then you can launch it because it was a seaplane, and then away you go. And it had two had a pilot and a gunner. You can carry about 400 pounds of bombs, or a small torpedo. And then it had 7.7 millimeter machine gun, a dual machine gun it had quite a bit of ammunition, actually. So it was, it had a what do you call it, like a little track system in there. So when you brought it back in, it could sort of like lock in place, right? And it was pretty innovative. I mean, it's one of those things that kind of like the Germans had when they would invent something really useful, instead of just double downing on it, tripling it, just going crazy on it and building a zillion of them.
So was there an attack on San Francisco with planes?
No. So what there was is, so you could say there was attack on the merchant shipping. So people were attacked that were on their way to Hawaii. So people who were on their way pre-December 7th, there was a couple of merchant ships that were sunk. And then once, and that's what FDR was talking about, what President Roosevelt was talking about is, so those were opportunistic, obviously those merchant ships and didn't know what was coming. So back then, when we would send merchant ships to Hawaii, people could tag along as like for a cheap trip, basically. And bring your family if you didn't have a lot of money or whatever. You could go to Hawaii that way, or if you were moving there or you were assigned there, or let's say your husband may have been assigned to the Navy and you were coming later, you could save money that way, whatever. So there was that was like a way to sort of move some civilians at the same time you're moving merchant shipping and merchant marines. And yeah, so that was, that's those submarines. So if you look them up, they're pretty, it's kind of fantastical, really. Yeah, and that's sort of the, and then they created another one called the I class, which was a sort of a higher end one. But they really didn't, strangely, they never really built a lot of these. Actually, so there is one thing that that they did hit. And so I grew up in Southern California. And if any of you have ever been to Southern California, there's a famous beach called Redondo Beach. So they did hit, there was some 5-inch shells that landed at Redondo Beach also. So that's, yeah, so so when people say nothing was ever hit on domestic continental soil, that's actually not true. I mean, it wasn't very significant, but so they did hit oil facilities with this, because we had a ton of oil facilities. I mean, basically all the oil facilities that were created in the West Coast were created because of going into World War II and World War II. So Southern California had a ton of oil facilities. And if you guys, any of you have been here long enough, or remember the company called Richfield Oil Company, which was a big oil company for quite a long time, and Occidental, and these were kind of like old American, oil companies. In Atlantic, Richfield merged, and that created Atlantic Richfield, which I think was bought out by Mobil maybe in like the 70s or something. But so yeah, so that's this sort of LA kind of gets raided, San Pedro, et cetera. So that's sort of a weird history. I can put a link in there on this, which I think will be kind of
Let me add something to that, Aaron. They also had a semi-successful bombing raid in Pacific Northwest where they tried to set the forest on fire.
Yeah, no, they did. So that's an interesting one too. So they sent these high altitude air balloons, which were, to be honest, incredibly well made. I mean, basically they're the best air balloons in the world. I mean, that sounds like who cares, but when it came to kind of being able to get intelligence, what's interesting is they didn't really use those for intelligence, right? Like it's kind of like they got the wrong application, because these things could go pretty high up. And if you could seal them, I mean, in theory, you could put a couple people in there and capture some intelligence if you can get them back. And, and if you didn't, you didn't. And, there was enough Japanese willing to do that, obviously. But so what they did is they would launch these from ships in the Pacific, and they figured out the sort of trajectory. And these were basically incineration. Like I forgot I never knew what the name of this is. What's the, whatever the carriage called in an air balloon, there's a term for that, but whatever that's called. They basically made a incineration, like a bunch of the equivalent of a incineration cluster, bomb out of it. And so it would drop at a certain point. It was time to drop these sort of incineration cluster bombs, these small ones, to try to start fires throughout the Northwest. This was still some of their like weird thinking that they could sort of start this like super fire across a big chunk of the United States in the Northwest, and that would work. Which it did start fires, and it scared people more, right? It had the terrorism sort of thing associated with it. People were, far more scared about that than they were anything else.
Yeah, the mission I'm specifically talking about, it was a submarine mission, and they did it with an airplane.
Okay.
The interesting thing on the way back, and they killed, I believe they killed 2 people because the mother and child, the mother picked up one of the defective weapons and that exploded in her hand.
Gotcha.
But on the way back, they sank a submarine off Alaska. And the most interesting thing about that, after the war, we found out it was a Russian submarine. It was Alaska, there's a submarine.
Yeah, of course.
American, they sank it. And nobody knew at the time.
Yeah, and I think that's, so what's really fascinating is they did create these incredible, so we got their duds because, they had a lot of duds, which is funny in the end. And they were really the cutting edge of incendiary explosives. So they would have these 170-pound incendiary bombs, which were actually pretty small. Like that's very compact. It lets you carry quite a few. And each one contained 500 igniting elements that would disperse over like basically a football field size area. And so, you could drop, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of these in different areas. And you could really start, a significant set of fires if you had enough wood or landscape areas or non-concrete structures. And so they had duds. We captured those duds and we turned those around and developed a lot of our incendiary bombs that turned around and hit Japan, several years later, or actually in the Doolittle raid, but they didn't use these for the Doolittle raid. But later, the innovations they had here, we wound up using, hitting them in Tokyo, in our Tokyo bombing raids. And they did get on that bombing run. You're right. I read about that. They did get 50 miles inland, actually. So, it's, so they, it's kind of, I'll put this link in there. It's kind of weird.
Yeah. So Aaron, let me ask you one question on that, because I've never been able to find out myself. Did they recover the crew? Because it sounds like these are one-way missions, because the submarine can't sit out there and wait for them to come back.
Well, no, on the Glens, yeah, absolutely. The Glens would turn around and fly back to a point. So what they would do is time, the submarine would, after the plane would launch, within 15 minutes, the submarine would, be able to go underwater, and then they would go to a point on the map, whatever, 3 hours later, 4 hours later, and they would meet there, and they'd be picked up. So no, the majority of those, unless they had a malfunction or shot down or whatever, almost all those pilots came back, because the Glens weren't one-way trips, right? The Glens were able to be used on multiple, sorties. What's fascinating is they did not really develop these as much as they probably should have. They were really a pretty innovative platform, if you think about it. And if you had, if you had 5 or 10 of these off of each of the major cities on the West Coast, that'd be chaos. It just would absolutely we were totally unprepared for something like that. We would have had, eventually we'd have to fly planes out and, and all that, and that would have worked. But, it just starts changing the spectrum of what you're defending, right? If you've got to put, defensive batteries for, 2,000 miles with airstrips every, 400 miles, you've got to have, half a dozen or more, squadrons to wings to defend you. That you're taking quite a bit of offensive capability out of the fight. You're taking hundreds of pilots, and we basically had a version of that on the Pacific side, on the Atlantic side, I should say, with the Civil Air Patrol, which still exists today. I live in New Jersey, in Teterboro. Any of you might know that. That's kind of became famous for for the Hudson landing, because some people thought he should try to turn and get to Teterboro, which would have been a disaster. Thank God he didn't do that. But Teterboro was built as a Civil Air Patrol base to protect, or to be one of the bases that protected Greater New York in World War II. So you didn't really have, you had a little bit of that on the West Coast, but you really didn't have, especially after Midway, right? You just didn't have anything like that after that. It was, the only fear was some submarines, really. And the Japanese were just so, they got sucked into the South Pacific after that, right? And then trying to defend, they would use their submarines to defend their merchant shipping. That was sort of that's instead of using surface ships, they would do that. But then that sucked all the submarines away from offensive capabilities.
All right, my friends. It's
Yes.
been 2 hours and somewhat 30 minutes. An incredible presentation. We catch that. We basically went in one breath. It was awesome, and the combination of the movies were incredible. I think we should do more of those. But what we can
Thank you
do
so
is-
much, Aaron.
Yeah,
Yes.
Aaron, appreciate it. It was
And
all
by the
about-
way, thank you, because this has been a 5-month effort to get to this one.
Oh, appreciate
Oh,
it.
no, we still have to do Midway, right? And
Yes. Well,
that's not going to be the end of it, right?
well, no,
we're
because
not-
actually no, not at all. I mean, I've got, whatever, 8 more or whatever to go. But the next one I want to do is the rest of this campaign. So this was part of a larger campaign the Japanese had across the Pacific for really the first, let's say, 100 days of the war. So the next one I want to do is going to cover, the rest of the operations that they did, including, the Philippines, obviously, which is the big one, but also, the other islands.
Don't forget Malaya and Singapore.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, no, and that's different than, I have to kind of go backwards. So the goal I want to do after this is to go backwards to 4041, which we sort of skipped over after the last presentation, because I just wanted to get this one in because it's December 7th. And right now the fleet would have been 340 miles. Oh, no, 290 miles away from their launch point, actually. So you can imagine that the next, by the time you wake up, they would be right around where they'd want to launch from tomorrow. So anyways, but yeah, I want to cover 1940-41, which is the Japanese attack and invasions against the other colonial powers. Whether it's the Dutch, whether it's the French, the English, and covering across Malay, Burma, India, Dutch East Indies, etc. So that's this first wave of the attack, which is happening the prior year and a half, and then this attack happens, and then it sort of culminates in the next 100 or so days, and then it doesn't even finish then, because then the Japanese do something which most people forget about, is they put hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers on literally almost 100 islands across the Pacific, who most of which just starved to death, basically, once the U.S. cut off their shipping. And then and then we'll eventually cover how the U.S. sort of island jumps, across all of those, and picks the ones it wants to fight on because it wants the airfields, basically, or they run a risk to Australia. Those are pretty much the two major drivers to the island hopping campaign.
All right, I will put them on the schedule, and then
Yep.
you could either concur or disagree on dates and let me know. And
Yeah.
also, Aaron, a different subject matter. I didn't realize I actually scheduled my electric vehicle and the sub-driver vehicle on the 17th. So next week I have a spot on Thursday for cryptocurrency, or it's too early.
Wait, so no, that's this Thursday, you mean?
Yeah,
Or
this,
the next Thursday?
next
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine this Thursday because I was ready the last time, so that's okay. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so guys, Aaron.
Hey, well, this isn't cryptocurrency. This is going to be digital currencies and blockchain and then these are applications from digital currencies, right?
Right.
So I want to be clear, cryptocurrencies are just an application
Right.
of blockchain, which is an application of ledgers and digital currencies themselves. So
Right.
there's no financial advice. There will be none. And there never will be
Zero.
zero. There will be anti-financial advice.
Yeah.
No, it's really just about understanding the technologies, and just for those that are interested in them. And it's not going to be much. There's not going to be much on Bitcoin and things like that, because that's a very. I mean, we can open it up to a conversation about why we think things are happening and why it's bubbles or whatever, but in terms of understanding what all this stuff means and how it's sort of layered. So
Right. So that's what we're going to do next Thursday, and just kind of skim through the schedule. On Wednesday we have where did Hitler gone wrong on the Russian campaign, and on Thursday, as I said, we have the blockchain. Then on Saturday we have Paul presenting Greek art part 2 classical period. Next week Wednesday we had Jonathan presenting on the a brother of Richard the Lionheart, John, the 1200s of England. On Thursday we have an understanding of electric vehicle of the future. Basically, we're going to particularly look at 3 biggest electronic vehicle companies, and how are they different from the gas companies, and what is different about them. So that would be on Thursday. And we have a bunch of good stuff on look in the schedule. We have a lot of good stuff. We have Idi Amin. We have Xenophon Anabasis, which, if you would like, basically suggestion is to read the book. Very interesting book. Mysticism compares to Greek history. And everybody knows so Xenophon was a general. So and then we have Richard presenting this month on the 20th, the Zionism State of Israel, which should be really interesting. So we have a lot of good stuff. So do join us on Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday next week, and more to come.
Yeah, I'm going to put this link in here right now on Japan sort of hitting, or attacking San Francisco and just all of that, which let me put that in there right now. It's pretty good. If you guys could just at least just click the link. It's really fascinating. I mean, it's kind of, I've always felt there's this thing that, I don't know if any of you have seen, it's called drunk history. I kind of think there's like a version that I would just sort of call weird history. And this to me sort of fits, weird history. Let me, hopefully you guys all got that. Did you guys get the link?
Yeah, but this will disappear when the session ends.
No, it won't. I will post it on if you go to YouTube channel, I'll post this YouTube channel, and I also would post everything that's been in the link. So as part of the comments, if you go in there, you'll see all those links.
Thanks.
No problem. Nothing disappears. It's all safe.
And then if you click on this, it's just a really neat article, because it's weird, right? I mean, it's this whole it's sort of fits that how the Germans would create something novel and then just sort of leave it there. It fits that sort of narrative, which thank goodness that happened. But I'm just saying, when you look at it in terms of what they did, it's pretty fascinating. So yeah, and one of the ones they did that most people don't realize is they sailed down the Baja California waterway, which is really weird when you think about that. So, they were literally hanging out in Baja, like in the inner bays. So,
well, what do they want to accomplish this way?
I mean, I think, if I'm being honest, all of these were pretty much sort of half-ass missions, and they were just sort of sailing around looking for opportunistic targets. And at a certain point, they just, They had this, they always had this sort of plan where, or they always had this mentality that if they got a plan, they would stick to it until they ran out of fuel, or not run out of fuel, but they ran to that red line, and then they would ask to turn around, and then they would ultimately turn around and go wherever they had to go to get refueled and get home or get to their next mission. So this is why I kind of call it like goofy history, it just sort of, or goofy war history, right? It just doesn't, and given how many, I mean, the Japanese, I think overall made something on the order of 50 to 100 of these type of submarines. So it's, it's enough to do, quite a bit with them. And they just used them in just the weirdest ways. That just didn't, it's almost like it's sort of like they invented something. They did not understand how it could be applied. It was like that was the miss, is they just couldn't recognize how this could be really useful for them. And I mean, to be honest, the number one way this could be useful is as a reconnaissance platform. I mean, it could be phenomenal for that, especially if if you could teach those pilots, how to fly at night, and you could paint the planes, basically black. You could do pretty well. I mean, you could, especially for forces that did not have any expectation. And if you could fly high enough, you could really get, you could capture some intelligence that you just wouldn't normally get. And so the Germans were better at this. Obviously their U-boat command going back to World War I, and I mean, it was, far more developed. But the Japanese just, their submarine command was never like a significant enough part of their overall command between their carriers and their battleships and heavy capital ships.
Did they have any serious attempts just to torpedo US ships?
No, they did. I mean, actually, it's very famous. I'd say the most famous ship, sadly, is the USS Indianapolis, that carried one of the atomic bombs, World War II. It was because it was on a radio silent mission. Because of that, it was sunk right after it dropped off the atomic bombs, and it was in the South Pacific. And there's a famous story, about all of the sailors that were, killed by tiger sharks. And if anyone remembers the original Jaws movie with Robert Shaw, and he's supposed to have been a sailor on the Indianapolis that survived, and tells the story and sings about it, etc. Yeah, I mean, they had significant naval attacks. They really hit the other ally navies really well, effectively. The French, the Dutch, the Italians, the English. The U.S., a lot of what the U.S. did, and we'll get into that at some point, but the U.S. really built, we talked about this a few months ago, this strategy to build this sort of fleet defense model. And especially once we built the carriers, we would put them in these sort of concentric rings of defense. We still have that to this day, basically. We just have missile shield versions of it, basically. And so we're always sort of launching these smaller, kind of almost large attack boats that stay ahead. And that just makes it a lot harder to have submarines down there. And then we would encircle with submarines also, trying to listen. So the rest of our allied navies then, and even now, struggle with that. They just don't have they don't have this. Well, they do actually have enough pieces. They just don't put it together the right way. And so, but yeah, I mean, but the Japanese did have, they probably sunk, they had to at least sunk 50 or 100 US. I mean, when you count merchant ships, probably hundreds really when you add it all up, but at least probably 30 combat ships of significance, and even carriers, right? So when Yorktown was hit, the Japanese subs are really kind of what sort of finished it off. And so, we did have, and the same with the Lexington. So the Japanese subs were out there. They just never, like, they never built that wolf pack, like the Germans built the wolf pack model, which was, I mean, to be honest, it's the Soviet and US model really to this day, right? You put these 2-4 submarine brigades and divisions together, and 12/8s, and you create this sort of underwater land army, and you put them at different levels. You hear things at different levels. You're trying to create this U under there where everything is under. The Soviets were the best at this in the world. Everything inside the U is like your kill box, and you can listen to it. And as long as you know where the other submarine is, you're not going to fire at it. And the Soviets had the crazy Ivan, right, strategy, right, which was overplayed, but it was still a real part of the strategy. But the Japanese had none of this. They used them as like these weird one-offs. And they actually had they had incredibly innovative submarines. But just like the Zeros, like one of the things, I think I forgot who it was earlier that was talking about the Zeros, but one of the things they did is they stopped sort of enhancing the Zeros, right? So as the Zeros ran into challenges, while the war was going on, they didn't really address those challenges very well, throughout the war. Whereas the US released, I mean, you look at going from the Wildcat, like probably the greatest thing the US did in World War II in the air is going from the Wildcat to the Hellcat. At some point, we'll go into that. The Hellcat was the Hellcat was basically unbeatable in World War II it was just, it was a fighter bomber. It was like armor plated. I mean, the thing was just a beast, and its physics were so small that it was incredibly maneuverable. So one of the things the US did, and I forgot the name of it, it was like the YU-4 or something, that the Soviets basically, US gave it, basically gave the Hellcat to the Soviets, and then they built a future version during the war, which was this little maneuverable ground attack plane that was incredibly effective. I'll find that out by the time I go.
So Soviet is Il-2.
Yeah, exactly. It's the Il-2. So the Il-2 is the Hellcat. It's the Soviet Hellcat, and that kicked the hell out of the Germans. I mean, that thing was a beast, and because it was so fast, German anti-aircraft was useless. The only thing that could deal with it with a Messerschmitts, but these Ul-2s did is they could run for a long time, and then the Messerschmitts didn't have enough fuel, and then that was it. Then the Messerschmitts would have to leave, and then they would come back, and they could also refuel in like 10 minutes. It was incredible. So the Hellcats were built that when they land on a deck of a carrier, they had 4 spouts, so 4 guys could run up and like a gas station, and just put in whatever 100 whatever it was, 100 gallons or a couple 100 gallons of fuel each, and get that in there in 5 minutes and be out.
Well, you have to attach another bombs there as well.
Well, yeah, no, of course you're putting more bombs, you're doing everything, but they could in that very short period of time get that aircraft off the ground quickly, which of course for the Soviets, the way they fought, they were always looking to have that speed, right? It was always about, having, being able to reload basically, and keep constant, keep the pressure on basically, continuously, which is basically what the US did in the ocean, right? I mean, in a weird way, the US naval strategy in the Pacific was very Soviet-like on ground, in terms of what the US did, or vice versa, really. We wanted to build this massive force and then just ram it up them, and then just keep it coming, and then just wear them through basically.
All right, Aaron, thanks a lot.
Good. Well, I'm so happy I did it. That's just all I really wanted in the end. I wanted to.
Aaron, I appreciate it. It was very nice, and we'll see more of this, and then we'll talk about the future topics.
Absolutely.
How to schedule. And thank you everybody for attending, and we'll see you Wednesday.
Yep. Oh, and one other thing, Zach, I wanted to bring up. So one of the magazine I put in there, or the whatever the online version of it now, it's called National Interest, and it's an interesting magazine. They have a lot of good articles. One thing that's neat about it is they have history and modern stuff. And one thing we could do at some point, if you're interested in, we could pick, and they cover regions really well too. So we could pick, some region that they cover, and then obviously we get other sources, and then we could maybe talk about an article or whatever, if that's something that kind of like we did with Nagorno-Karabakh, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of hot spots. I mean, the next conflict I want to cover is India, Pakistan, or China. China, India. Those are always, or I mean, I don't want to touch on Israeli Palestinian. It feels like it's been beat to death. I just want to do the ones that people are not very familiar with.
Well, I'll tell you one that would be interesting, and I know Ralph has some good stuff on this too, would be Libya. Because I think most people just don't have a really good sense, especially obviously the last decade,
Yeah, all this competition between Turks, Russians, and
French,
yeah.
Turks, Russians, French,
Yeah.
sometimes the
Yeah, but
US.
I would even go further. I would go when that Scottish airline went down. I mean, I want to even go to Gaddafi time.
Yeah, no, I mean, so you could break it up into the part one, sort of the Gaddafi era, or or let's say even part one would be the independence era, after they got independence, and then you could have like the Gaddafi era, and then you could have the last decade when everything went sideways. It's kind of weird. I was talking to a friend of mine about this. I mean, if you told someone 20 years ago, God, it'd be great if Gaddafi was still in charge of Libya, like people would just think you're insane, right? I mean, it just sort of like, it just tells you that if a place really just dismembers, whatever was there before just feels better, even though that doesn't feel very morally satisfying.
You say Saddam Hussein was better for
Well, yeah, no, I mean, if we're going to be blunt, absolutely. I mean, there's almost no way around it. The problem with that long term is, unless we could give him a perpetual life machine, eventually he passes away, and then Uday and Qusay are probably not, tolerable by anybody, because they were basically Ted Bundy sociopaths. I mean, like real ones. So that's where that all becomes a problem, obviously. But I'm just saying, it's not so much like what would have really happened. It's just this idea that, if a place changes for the sake of changing, or because of a revolution, you always hope it's better, right? I mean, I think Egypt's sort of gotten back-ish to late Mubarak, but they've had to, I mean, let's be honest, they've had to kind of go through this crazy dip to get back to sort of the end of Mubarak. And it's sort of like, well, maybe Mubarak still around wouldn't be the craziest thing in the world, right? I will say this, I've always found this very fascinating, is Egypt was able to go through all of this, and there was never a risk or a change to its relationship with Israel. I actually feel that there's something there. There's a certain stability within its armed forces, within its political leadership, that they're able, all the craziness that was going on there in Egypt for 5-7 years, they never moved out of that prior kind of relationship agreements they had with Israel, which is I think that's pretty rare, actually.
It's pretty rare, and you can look at Turkey and see a very different, the opposite.
The opposite. That's exactly right. Exactly. I mean, Turkey has had more back and forth with Israel in the last 15, especially the last 10 years, than Egypt's had the last 10 years with Israel.
And it's to big extent goes to personalities.
Exactly. There is a stability, whether it's, CC and, the pre-CCs and the post-CCs.
Morsi.
Yeah. Well, it's like you have this military, kind of, it's almost like the way Pakistan has been, where you have this this core of its military leadership, and then the political leadership is sort of like on the outside of it, like the crust of the pizza, but the pizza itself is the military, and they didn't. I mean, nothing changed there. I mean, the Israelis, I mean, I'm sure everyone had moments of being freaked out and picking up the phone and calling someone on their, second, third, fourth line and say, hey, everything okay? And, and satellites and everything, and nothing changed, which is, I think that's remarkable, actually. I really do. I think it's insane how rare that is. So anyways, but I think that would be an interesting thing to cover too, is, the Arab Spring. That could be really interesting.
But then you can't just do Arab Spring. Now you have to do Orange Revolution in Ukraine. You gotta do.
Oh, of course. You
gotta. It kind of like all meshes in.
Yeah, no, it does. Well, the question is, does it? I mean, does it mesh in because it?
I don't feel that way, that it meshes.
Exactly.
Anyway.
It kind of like all happened at the same time. I mean,
yeah, but see, that's my point. I think there's a confirmation bias there, that it happened at the same time. So we think each of them directly fed off of each other's grievances, and I just don't think that was what was going on.
I think that that's correct. If we look at the start of the Tunisian Revolution, we see that there's agitation in Algeria, and there was huge economic pressure in Tunisia. It was the whole self-immolation of Bouazizi, which we can get into if we ever do Arab Spring. But I don't think that they were looking towards Eastern Europe as sort of a bellwether.
Yep.
It was just Eastern Europe. Kyrgyzstan has nothing to do with Eastern Europe.
Well, it's completely separate.
It's completely separate.
Separate, yeah.
It's just, I think the internet and people with social.
Well, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, was able to open up. I mean, the issues were different, no question about it.
So the question is, how much, I mean, this is the test case, right? Which, we have no way of validating, but we can just, have hypotheses on, is how much of these things were going to happen, period. If let's say it was internet 2002, in 2010, how much of, how many of these events were going to happen, and how many, and then what was the additive of the internet to these events, as almost a second part. So the one thing I would say is, obviously the internet was a jet fuel, right? I mean, it definitely amplified what was going on with Facebook and Twitter, and mostly Facebook and Twitter, of course, and those were amplifiers. But the underlying kind of drivers, right? What was it, a flower cart? I forgot what it was, a food cart or flower cart that he had.
I think it was a food cart. You're talking about Bouazizi. He had a food cart.
Exactly. Yeah, and the fact that he self-immolated himself, and it was a female policewoman too, right? I mean, it's just sort of like the whole story is really weird. And they gave him a ticket, and and it was just obviously contributed. So how much of that would have happened anyways, and then how much of that sort of amplified because you had the internet, and how much of that was a feedback loop, and then how much of that in the end is our Western media consumption of it, which then gives us these narratives, versus the people who live there, who, I'm sure if you're Tunisian or Algerian or Libyan or Egyptian, whatever, about what happened next door, but that likely isn't your North Star, right? Your North Star is the events and the grievances you had at that point, and you probably still have.
Well, I mean, the thing is that in a lot of these countries, the grievances are primarily the same, which is that you have autocratic rulers who have numerous economically repressive laws that entrench wealth in a very small percentage of the population.
Exactly.
And there's really no way, meritocratically speaking, to acquire that kind of wealth the same way that there is in the United States or in other Western countries, which creates that safety valve. And until you had the Tunisian system really, crumble, with Zine Abidine bin Ali's abdication, it seemed to most Arabs that across their world that system was impenetrable, except through an outside-led revolution like Iraq, which nobody wanted.
No one wanted at that point.
So, but when Tunisia fell and it was relatively peaceful, Arab people in other countries started protesting, saying, "We have the same problem.
That's
We
right.
want the same solution." So that, like, I don't see a connection to Eastern Europe. And I mean, we can talk about the economic situation in the 90s up to the early aughts in the Arab world, and why that was the fertile ground for this kind of mass democratization revolution. And I think that would be an interesting set of conversations to have.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that the thing that most people still forget is that just like you've had in the same challenges across Latin America, a lot of the and even in, really all over the world, but Latin America, has really been highlighted for decades, is that a lot of this is tied up in what it used to be called in economics or development economics, land reform. And because that's a path of some degree of plurality, and that's what I think is different about Tunisia and even Algeria, for that matter, is that they didn't just go down more, like quote unquote more democracy, which I think a lot of people just think, more voting and more elections and more press freedom, which is true. But it's these reform agendas that democratize sort of your economic system, and that's the piece that I think almost everybody misses, and I'd say the media for sure. And
That's absolutely right. No, the thing is that when it's very funny if you talk to Arabs and you ask, you say you want democracy, what does that mean? And the answers they give are all economic. They never say anything about like what democracy means to us is greater freedom of the press. I mean, like there are advocacy organizations, especially in Tunisia, because Tunisia tends to be more European leaning, that will say things like that. But generally speaking, they'll say things like, "I want to be able to open up my shop and sell things," or "I want to be able to buy land or I want to have money to give to my kids," which sound very disjointed answers to the question, "Why do you want more democracy?" And so the politicians that capitalized on that and were able to provide an economic answer, those were the ones that were able to entrench their rule, either in a post-revolution scenario, like in Tunisia, or in a pre-revolution scenario, like Kuwait. The Kuwaiti government literally gave out something on the order of $3,500 to every Kuwaiti citizen, and the revolts and they had some early marches. All the marches just stopped.
Because and one of the things that I think becomes important if we do something like this, which would be great, is in a lot of these countries, if your military leadership, basically your junta light, was also dominant economically, it was impossible to have reform, right? Because you're really asking them to give up quite a bit. But if you had this separation between the military having consolidated wealth and a set of elite, then you had a way to sort of chip away at some of those. And a great example of this is actually Colombia. But so you have other parts of the world where they've been able to sort of, make a lot of that work. And the same thing in Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco. So there's something about the northwestern Africa, and obviously some combination of influence of Europeans, but also I think it's lack of concentration, a density. It's just a different dynamic there. It's more Arizona, Nevada-y than it is.
So I take it you guys want to do the Arab Spring together.
Yeah, I'd love to do a collab with Aaron on this.
Let's do it. Okay, I'll put it in one of those days on the.
We can do it, sometime in June of 2021.
Yeah.
When the schedule finally opens up.
No, but actually, what would be cool too is I don't know, if Mikhail wants to help out on maybe Russia, like Russia's various involvements at times, because they've been, this very.
I want Mikhail to do Crimea, Russia versus.
Oh, that would be awesome. Yeah.
What? To do what?
Crimean.
Crimea, 2014.
We're talking about a circumcision of Ukraine.
Yeah, well, where do you want it?
Oh, it's going to be far down. I mean,
Okay,
you know,
we can discuss it closer to the time.
Yeah.
One things, guys, as far as Russia and Middle East is concerned, I believe you heard about this theory, or maybe it's a fact, I don't know, I don't have any hard data, that it's known fact that in 2010 or 20, I believe 2010, Russia stopped grain export.
Yep.
And that caused a food shortage in Middle East in particular.
Yeah, especially Egypt. Egypt.
Which has been a big boost to all this whatever Arabian Spring.
Exactly. No, I mean, look, there's always been this dynamic going back, you know, I guess hundreds of years where bread, you know, and as a, I mean, really hundreds of years, geez, thousands of years, right? Egyptians, you know, like revolted, you know, whatever, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. So, you know, there's always been this association with bread and sort of stable society. And, you know, just very much like it's, you know, I work for a company that's based in Mexico, and gasoline prices are like that in a lot of Latin America, right? Like you just don't mess with the gasoline prices because people have just sort of baked that in, as no pun intended, with bread, but like that's just what it is. And there's a dynamic that you see that with rice in Asia. You know, there's something about these mainline, almost cultural resources that are, you know, that people's identity has this deep association with. And if you mess with that, people just lose it, right? It's just that you're not negotiating, there's no conversations, there's no tax credits, like no one wants to listen to anything, you know, it's just the way it is. You know?
All right, my friends, I have to jet, and
Yes.
that was a pleasure. Aaron, thank you.
You're welcome.
Everybody, thank you for discussing.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys. Everyone stay
I'll see you
safe.
Wednesday, guys. All right.
Yep, enjoy
Thank you,
some
Aaron.
football
Well done.
and some food. Thanks. Yep, enjoy dinner.